All right. Today we have a presentation on Stalingrad, World War II, Russia versus Germany, and basically we will be discussing um, how the Germans had basically stopped at the Stalingrad, and eventually was a turning point of the World War II. So I guess tune in, listen to our channel, and listen to the Stalingrad presentation. We have Hadrian, who is going to discuss a German side of things, particularly, and we have Aaron, who is going to discuss the Russian side of things. Mikhail, Mark, how are you? Mark, Mikhail, how are you guys?
But here's my concern with fostering, and this is just something that I have noticed, is I think when you start to foster an animal, they're not as actively looking to find a home for that animal.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah, so you can take it last for a while.
Right, and that's always, so Mary's brother, same Mary, agreed to foster Yoshi, for example.
Hi, how are you? Marika, how's it going? How's it going?
Pretty well, everything under control for now.
Mm-hmm.
Not much. I'm going to mute, okay?
Okay, no problem. Hi, Joe, how are you?
What's up, Zach?
How are you? Share. So share. Hi, Aaron. Oh, he's joining. Hi, Aaron. How are you?
Doing great. How about you?
Good. Oh my God, what an exciting presentation today. You know, what's interesting is I don't know where Hadrian is.
Okay.
I gotta find out. If not Hadrian, it's gonna be all you, my friend.
All right. That's okay. We can have a good discussion, and we've got.
Oh, here's Hadrian. Here's Hadrian.
Right.
You wouldn't miss it for the world. Hi, Sergio. Hi, Hadrian. So just to give people, not everybody's logged in. We're supposed to have 20 people today,
Yep.
which is on Wednesday is a great turnout, guys. I mean, people like Stalingrad, and even the ones that couldn't make it, I apologized and said this was a great topic, but couldn't make it. So today it's a second discussion in our World War II Russian, or Eastern invasion of Germany. And so basically today we're going to discuss Stalingrad, and the next one is going to be Kursk. And from just the two quotes I'll give, I said the Poland was conquered in 28 days, and it only took Germans to conquer one building in Stalingrad in 28 days. And France was conquered in 38 days, and it's only took them to cross the street in Stalingrad in 38 days, just to show you how crazy that fight was. And Hadrian is going to talk about the German side of things, and Aaron is going to talk about Russian side of things. It says Hadrian is joining us, but it still says joining for some reason. So it'll be an interesting discussion. And so today, guys, pile in as much question, as much controversy you can throw in. There's going to be a heated discussion, interesting stuff, whatever knowledge of, I guess, the battle itself. And I mean, it's hard to call it a battle. It's more like a grinding.
You think, and he's barely eaten. He only ate last night after I fell asleep, and he barely.
Oh, Mark.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Tonight after I fell asleep.
I think Mark's talking to his wife, actually.
Yeah, let me mute him. Okay. So who is going to start first, Aaron? Is this Hadrian or you?
I mean, I think it sort of makes sense that Hadrian starts representing the German offensive, and then
All right.
I don't know. It's up to you guys. I mean, whatever.
Hadrian, you can share. You have ability to share. I don't have to pass the control to you. You can go ahead and share. How are you?
Yeah, actually, I didn't have the time to prepare like a visual presentation, but
All right. I mean, so Aaron, do you have any maps that then?
Yeah. So I have, you know me. I have
Put the maps on, and then Hadrian will talk about the
Okay.
German side of things. And
Give me a second. Let me pull up some stuff here to make it appropriate because I have different material.
you're talking about you could also get inappropriate here.
No. I meant like
I don't think
mean that.
I don't think I can handle on Wednesday night.
Yes, no. I don't mean that kind of inappropriate. I mean just history, like different presentations. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
All right, let me pull this up here. Give me a second.
How's everybody doing on Wednesday night, guys? And
All right.
yeah, very nice. America's showing. Yeah.
You guys, hold on. Let me put this up. Current slide.
Nice.
You see that? I have some other ones that are far more detailed, but I think that might be a good one just to start with. I don't know if you think that. Tell me if you want more detail. I can pull up more detail, but I don't know if you like that as just sort of a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we start with, Hadrian, give a summary. What was the reason why they went to Stalingrad and all that stuff, and then take it from there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sorry. This was the Barbarossa. That was my bad. So
yeah, what are we? Why are we in Barbarossa?
No, I know. I just that's why I said it's like it's a different. I have different presentations. So let me fix this for a second. Just give me a second here. Sorry about that. So Hadrian, you want to kick off, and I'll pull up the map. Don't worry. Just give me a second here.
yeah. Yeah, so so as you know, when the Germans started World War II, they had a series of victories, mainly because they benefited from the infrastructure and the small size of the countries which they were targeting. And so it was very easy, for instance, to penetrate France extremely fast, given the infrastructure in France. But one of the problems of the German army was always oil. And see, the problem is that in Europe, there are not many places where you can find oil. There are oil fields in Romania, which was the ally of Germany, but the closest oil fields that Hitler could get his hands on were the oil fields of the Baku region in Russia. And the idea of Hitler was to invade Russia, and he thought that basically in World War I, it took I think it was like a few months to get Russia to surrender, but over the course of the 4 years, they couldn't get France to surrender. And Hitler thought that because Russia was historically a much softer target than France, if he had managed to beat France so fast in World War II, then naturally Russia would fold easily, and then he would be able to get all the land and as well as the oil from the Baku region, and from there he could, basically just invade all the countries in the Middle East, maybe go to the British Raj, and essentially conquer the entire world. One thing that's quite interesting is that when the Russian army started invading Russia, they had a lot of horses. They were carrying men and equipment on horses, and one of the main problems for them was actually finding enough food for all of their horses. And so basically, because the Baku oil fields was one of the primary objectives, Hitler sent the 6th Army towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus region. And for some reason, he decided to split the army in two. One of them, he decided to send some of his forces directly through the Caucasus Mountains to get to the oil fields. And he also diverted forces to take Stalingrad, which was essentially a target for propaganda purposes.
Do you guys see the map right now or no?
Yes, we see the map. Yes.
Yeah.
Hadrian, is that good? Does that work
Yeah.
for you? I have different maps, so.
Do you have a map of the Caucasus region?
Yeah, I do. All right, I'll bounce to that one. So just keep going. Okay.
Yeah, so if you look at the Caucasus region, there seems to be like a kind of like a sliver of land towards the east that looks to be like a easy way to reach the oil fields, but actually it's not, because it's full of marshes. So that's why the portion of the German army that went through the Caucasus had to go through the middle, and that was very difficult because you have it's easy to defend. You have a limited you have a very limited space in which to go. And so they never got to capture like an intact oil field. They captured some, but each time they got to one, either the Russians would have put it on fire, or the Germans, by bombing the Russians, would have set it on fire themselves. So when they got to Stalingrad, at first it was an easy advance, but as they got closer to Steingrad, their advance got slower and slower as the Russians started reinforcing near Stalingrad. So basically, Stalin at first gave a lot of ground to the German army in the early days of Barbarossa. But then Stalin decided to not let his men retreat at one point. So he told his generals, do not retreat, do not retreat. And what this caused was that there were massive, prior to Stalingrad, massive encirclements of Russian troops. So at one point, for instance, the German army captured, I think it was around 350,000 Russians in a pocket that closed before they got close to Stalingrad. So the Germans were pretty confident. And when they arrived, the weather started to change. And also, they could not manage to get to the other side of the Volga River. So if you look at Stalingrad, it's near a river, on the eastern side of which the Russians had put all of their artillery, and they were funneling troops inside Stalingrad, and troops and resources.
Is this good? Does this work for you, this
Yeah.
map?
Yeah. So what I understood was that the leader of the 6th Army was called Paulus, and basically he was apparently like a friend of Hitler or something that got promoted prior to the invasion. So he could have been like not the best commander for that particular mission. And one problem that the German had faced was the T-34 Russian tank, which was extremely good. It was probably the best tank in the war. And you can see footage of Germans firing on the T-34, and you would have, for instance, all of their guns would basically bounce off. So one T-34 would maybe not have been enough to defeat like a German Tiger tank, but the T-34s were massively produced, and the Germans had a lot less tanks than the Russians. And it turned out that the light tank with which the Germans invaded so easily the other countries in Europe was completely inadequate for fighting against the T-34. Like the barrel was too short, the weapon did not have enough penetrative power, and basically at first they just tried to shoot down the tanks with their tanks, which didn't work. And then it turned out that the Germans had the 80 millimeter cannon, which was an anti-aircraft gun. And this anti-aircraft gun was able to penetrate the T-34 and destroy it. And so a lot of the resources, industrial resources of Germany were diverted to the construction of these guns. Unfortunately, because of the Allied bombings in basically in France that started to ramp up during the Russian campaign, a lot of these guns were recalled back to Europe, which was a disaster for the Germans. So, because they didn't have the guns that were necessary to penetrate the Russian tanks. And on top of that, the Germans, at the moment when they invaded Russia, like that's the exact moment where the Japanese signed a non-aggression pact. So there was no two fronts, and Stalin was able to recall divisions from the Eastern Front to help repel the German attack. And also, a lot of the equipment of the Russians was actually constructed, built by the US. And I think basically the Russians were able to focus on tanks. They were able to focus on what they were good at. So the T-34 tank, the artillery, but almost all of their other equipment, like their trucks, for instance, were given to them by the Americans. And what's crazy is that towards the end of the war, basically, like the Russians had an enormous amount of American trucks, and they were actually more motorized than the German army, if you can believe that. So another problem that the Germans had was that as winter came, the Russians were able to have these special lubricants that made their tanks work in the cold, but the Germans did not. And so just to give you an idea, like it would be like sometimes during the fighting at Stalingrad, the temperature would have been like minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And so at that temperature, the diesel of your Tiger tank would literally freeze, and you couldn't even start the tank. And another problem that the Germans had was that a lot of their equipment, so their tanks, their planes, etc., was over-engineered. Like it was really, really good, but it also required a ton of maintenance. And it's not so easy to maintain your stuff across the long supply lines of Russia and to keep your tanks in order and in good shape. And so basically by the time the Germans arrived to Stalingrad, their supply chains were overextended. They couldn't get proper care of their equipment. They were not prepared to fight a winter war. They were overconfident because of their previous victories, and they had split their army into with one part of the army, which was composed of the Romanian and Italian allies that was trying to get to the oil fields, and the other part that went to Stalingrad. And when they arrived to Stalingrad, they didn't capture the eastern part of the Volga, and they were fired upon by the Russian artillery, basically all the way there. And they faced, it was a really slow battle, Stalingrad. So they would fight for each house, each street. They would fight for like 15 days just to capture like a warehouse, for instance. And at first, the Germans were surrounding the Russians, but then at one point there was a counteroffensive on the Russian side, and the Russians ended up surrounding the Germans. And Hitler forbade the Germans that were trapped in the city from surrendering. And he even named Paulus, which was the general of the army in Stalingrad. He named him Field Marshal because no field marshal had ever been captured alive on the German side. and it was essentially an order to fight to the death. And so before the entrapment, a lot of Germans that were in Stalingrad were basically trying to escape. So they would, try to get wounded because at that time you still had a possibility of being brought back to the rear. And during the encirclement, the Germans had managed at first to have two air bases still operating in Stalingrad, and they were able to bring about 100 tons of supplies daily, which wasn't enough for the amount of troops inside Stalingrad, which required 700 tons. So towards the end of the battles, the Germans were actually starving to death, and they ate all of their horses. And of the Germans that surrendered during that battle, I think only like 3,000 or 4,000 managed to survive, and those that survived were they came back home like 10 years later, and 10 or 20 years later, 10 or 12 years later, like in 57, and
Adrian, one question. I apologize to interrupt. I know. So Hitler, in his infamous writing Mein Kampf, made a concrete point saying that, listen, dividing the army it's considered to be death of the army. Why do you make that mistake and divided the army like that when he knew particularly, and even wrote in his memoirs, I mean, you can call it his memoirs, I guess, that dividing army was lethal?
I've seen, to prepare this, I've seen like 2 lectures by 2 different guys on the topic, and both of them had a different opinion. So there was one that thought that Hitler had made a mistake because he thought it would be very easy to get to the oil fields. And I think another one was saying that Hitler was basically, I think, wait, let me think. So I think both of them actually thought it was a mistake, but it's more on the nature of the mistake. So I guess it's on who to blame for that mistake.
Yeah, I saw a documentary, that Hitler was just totally crazy. I mean, with the whole chain of command of who would be in command of the Luftwaffe and the Panzer Unit, all this. I mean, there was really no structure and command on that front. So that might be something. That might have been one of the reasons, you know?
Yeah, it could be that he would maybe ill-advised, you know. Maybe he thought he had broken the Russian army already.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's almost like the same thing the Japanese had, where they had this sort of delusional, understanding that how, in essence, how massively powerful either the Soviet Union or with the Japanese United States were in terms of being able to muster men and material and resources. And so they all had this sort of sense that, well, we could sort of knock them out or fold them over in 6 months and get them to sort of sign a peace deal, and when you kind of leap from there as your like a prior, and that's your prior that you're working from, almost like everything else, all the rest of the dominoes are in place. And, instead of really saying, well, scenario planning, what happens if, right? There wasn't really a lot of that going on. And the handful of commanders who challenged that, didn't fare very well. So I think that's a lot to do with the psychology involved.
And there was also the another thing I saw is the like Stalin made it like on purpose. He didn't evacuate Stalingrad when it was being approached by the German army, because his reasoning was that soldiers would fight harder if they had behind them civilians that were in danger. And so they actually took like women and children and literally everyone, and they would give them a shovel and they would dig anti-tank traps and defenses all around the city.
Is
Yeah.
it possible that they had a lot of misinformation, the Germans, that they were
Sure.
totally off the chart because they have
Well,
the
yeah,
wrong information?
yeah. So one of the pieces I know is that the Germans radically misunderstood the status and the disposition of Soviet forces, and more importantly, the reconstitution and the redevelopment. And so they, you know, it's like anybody that is looking for confirmation bias, right? They read the purges as they don't have command. They read their struggles with the Finns as saying that they're not as strong. They read the very weak, or what looked like to be weak equipment and not cutting edge technology. You know, so they constantly looked for a set of sort of prior confirmation biases that would always, you know, put the Soviets in this lower risk category. And of course, there's the whole massive Slavic dehumanization, they're lesser people, blah, 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 all that stuff, which is a big contributor, of course. And so when you put all that together, that builds this incredibly powerful narrative that becomes really hard to sit there and say, well, you know, if the Soviets have these 20 pieces in place and line them up like bowling pins, and we have our 400 pieces, but they're all fragmented, well, their 20 pieces beats ours. I mean, really, no one's taking that up to the top of the command and, you know, and doing anything more than being assigned to, you know, guard, you know, whatever, Danish compounds or something, right? I mean, you
So
know,
maybe if you have the right information, you cannot present it because everybody was wanting to think something else.
well, yeah, exactly. And then I know Hadrian brought up earlier what the Soviets did, and it's famous order number 227 or 227. And
One step back, yeah.
yeah, and I cannot say the Russian, but is it Nai Shagu Nazad? Is that correct? No, not one step backwards.
Nie шагу назад.
Okay.
Nie шагу назад.
Okay.
Ni шагу назад.
Ni. Okay. So Ni Shagu Nazad. So, you know, and that was, you know, and that was like, that was transmitted, you know, I mean, that was like DNA, you know what I mean? And you obviously you can't underestimate what that means when you have, you know, a dozen armies, you know, and, you know, 30, 40 corps and, you know, 75 divisions who have that baked into them, you know, hundreds of regiments and brigades and, you know, 1,000, you know, battalions. I mean, it's just, that's just a massive shift in the definition of warfare, right? I mean, it really is. I'm not saying there haven't been forces in history that have fought to the death. There have, of course. We reviewed that in our history series here, but you've never had one at the size of the Soviet forces that have been basically told to fight to the death, right? I mean, that is a, you know, and you can't underestimate the size of force you would need to conquer that, right? I mean, when you deal with defensive positions, there's an assumption that at a certain point in breaking a defensive position, the people in the defensive position don't want to die, right? And that's, but if you literally have to believe you have to destroy everyone in the defensive position, instead of having a 2-to-1 or 3 or 4-to-1, you might need a 5 or 10 or 15-to-1 ratio.
Well, Aaron, then a follow-up question, I guess.
Yeah.
So, you know, we understand Ni шагу назад, that's a Russian way, no, you know, not even a step back. But here you have Hitler that's promoting, you know, his general to the field general, basically giving him a notification that no field general ever gave up to an opposing troops ever. And basically giving him a notice, like basically it's also Ni Shago Nazad for Germans.
Yeah.
What was his thought process that absolutely not an important urbanized city that you could have just gone somewhere else and they would have gone to Baku without conquering that, and he's being in principle of it was trying to go for that city. I don't understand that.
Well, because remember, I mean, I think in the end, the big difference, and I think this is a difference from the old world to the newer world, is that, you know, Hitler was governed a lot more by this sort of, almost like Napoleonic, the imagery and the symbology and taking the city with its name on it, right? Like at that, like those things matter more than the actual results, right? And I think, it's very different when you have a strategy, a truly von Clausewitz or Alfred Thayer Mahan or whatever, that is looking to wherever, find the place in a battle that is to your advantage to destroy a significant enough amount of the opposing forces that allows you to sustain that advantage and to continue to do that until those forces don't exist or ultimately surrender. It doesn't matter if you're doing that in Siberia or it doesn't matter if you're doing it in the Caucasus. I think Hitler's view is that, it's almost like he was free fighting Napoleon's war in a weird way, right? Like, we want to take Moscow. Like, at the end of the day, if the Soviets lost Moscow, which would have been horrible, what, they would have stopped fighting? Of course not, right? They just would have flanked at a certain point, right? And so let's pretend Hitler took Stalingrad and Moscow. I actually almost view it as almost, I'm not saying it's irrelevant because you were to destroy a huge amount of his forces, but it wouldn't have mattered in the end. It wouldn't have changed the outcome because the Soviets would have kept, finding ways to flank and attack because the Germans would have gotten more spread out. Those supply lines would have been impossible. I mean, they already were impossible. They'd have been infinitely impossible. I mean, how do you move resources for 1 million people 1,000 miles, right?
Also, this is really interesting. So the lifespan of a Russian soldier in Stalingrad was 24 hours. So you would basically come into the city, live 24 hours, die, and someone else would pick up where you left off.
Well, and I'll give you a great example of this. So 13th Guards Division, which is one of the most decorated divisions in Soviet Army history, or Russian Army history, really. They entered the battle with 10,000 men in that division, and they suffered about 84% casualties in the first week in the city. That's in 1 week. I mean, so I mean, generally speaking, your division is combat ineffective. In the modern world, it's even lower. It's like 30%. But in the older world, let's say it's 50%. I mean, 84% in a week. I mean, you're basically combat effective in 4 or 5 days, if that. And it didn't matter. Because remember, if you're not backing up, your combat effectiveness actually lasts longer.
Right.
Wait, I actually have a question based on Zach's question. Why is it that, just sort of, Zach, why do you assume that taking Stalingrad would not have been necessary to march on Baku? Like, like, at least geographically, Stalingrad is on the mouth of the Volga River and would have been the direct way to attack the German supply lines that were heading towards the Caucasus. So how could they have avoided Stalingrad effectively? Just like, I understand the symbology, and that's probably the motivation for the attack, but I'm just trying to figure out strategically why you wouldn't need to take it.
Well, I think if they had taken, like, the ports of Crimea, for instance, well, like, the Russians would have lost their fleet. Like, I'm not sure if Turkey would have allowed Russia to bring their fleet anywhere. And so, from that point on, if there's, like, no more Russian fleet in the Black Sea, I don't think you need Stalingrad. Like, you could probably just supply yourself across the sea. You just take the shoreline and...
I mean, what's interesting is you're sort of arguing the Germans having let's call it the land version of the island hopping campaign that the US had in the Pacific, which is to sort of cherry pick off strategic points that starts to isolate the huge amount of Soviet forces, and then ideally you don't just cut off their supply lines, or you basically disrupt them so much that you basically try to starve them out in the field. I mean, I actually think if there is a strategy that even had a shot at best, that's probably the only one that even had a shot. I mean, I've really, to be honest, I've never really believed the Germans could have. There's nothing you could have done. You could have had space aliens on their side, and I think the Soviets were going to annihilate them.
Well, I mean, I think like if before invading Russia, they had invaded like Turkey, it would have been much easier, like because they had taken Greece already, and I think invading Turkey, like the Turkish army, is much easier to deal with than the USSR. But I think Turkey was being, if I'm not mistaken, I think the independence of Turkey was guaranteed by Stalin. Because,
No, I think Turkey was neutral in that war. And just invading Turkey, just like creating, just have another army against you. That would be counterproductive.
No. But the question is, would Stalin have seen that as an act of war? Because if not, if you had been able to move your troops to the part of Turkey that's bordering the Baku oil fields, then it's much easier to invade. So
yeah, well, I know there is a theory that if Hitler wouldn't move against Moscow and Leningrad, but just concentrate all the forces on the southern, in the southern direction and just take the oil fields, that would be the winning strategy. I mean, from what I read.
Right.
Could I just add about Stalingrad? From what I read, I mean, there was a tactical advantage of going for Stalingrad besides the symbolic one. Is that they were planning to cut off the Volga River was the main supply line of oil through the rest of the Russia, and they would have cut off the oil first, and second, this place where the River Don and River Volga has come close, they felt that they were more protected on their flanks and the rear by another river. I mean, that was this tactical consideration in addition to everything else.
Yeah.
Aaron?
Yes.
This is Ann Broom.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, what do you given that Russia has always been this bête noire for Western forces, I mean, it sucked up Napoleon.
Not an accident.
Yeah. Well, what did the Germans think? What secret sauce did they think they had that would make it different for them?
I mean, if I'm being objective from everything I've read, it's this litany of our technology's better. Obviously, we're better humans, even though we use the word Aryan, even though those people come from Asia Minor, but we all know that. But, we're these magical people. We're better. Our technology's better. We're smarter. They suck. Their weapons are bad. They're poorly led. They're animals. I mean, it's all of this sort of, our side is the greatest, ever. Their side is the worst ever. Those priors so gauge their belief of how they could defeat the Soviets. And of course, how the Soviets performed against Finland, which I argue everyone on earth was going to perform that way against Finland, because, it's the second, it's arguably, I don't know, it's either the first or the second dumbest thing ever to do. Maybe the third, get the American Navy in, invade Finland, invade the Soviet Union. I kind of put them all three together as like three of the dumbest ones you can do. And so, but I think the Germans had that lens that they were going through, instead of the objective lens, which is this place is 1 billion miles in size. Napoleon, lost everything, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, you're asking something else.
Yeah, no. That's a perfect answer. I was just laughing when you said, not laughing, but smiling when you were saying about the 1 billion miles, which is true. I mean, it's the biggest landmass that claims national sovereignty still on the globe. And one thing they know how to do is protect their border by just sucking you in,
exactly.
And then letting you starve to death. But do you think that, did Germany from the get-go plan on a two-front war like they did in the First World War? Or did this sort of, it became inevitable?
I mean, that's one of those weird ones, which is they had some form of manifest destiny ideology that they had to take the Soviet. It's very much like the way the Japanese, right? The Japanese had to keep taking places that had resources so they can fuel their ability to have a force so big that it can keep taking places that had resources, right? It was this paradox wrapped in its own enigma that just kept kind of rolling. And I think the Soviet, and of course for the Germans, the Soviet Union, I think represented this combination of cultural and material and psychological, all the things you could put together, sort of threat or sort of perspective. And I think that just sort of fed them into it. I mean, one of the ones that's so fascinating to me is one of their great commanders the Germans had, von Manstein. He studied the Battle of Cockengoel, which was obviously an awesome combined arms, at that point, the largest combined arms combat in history. The 57th Corps under Zhukov, and so he obviously knew they were capable of doing that, but they weren't able to process that, like intellectually, sociologically, that, well, maybe they got more than one of those. Maybe they got 10 of those. Maybe they got 50 of them. Well, if they do, what would we be ready to do with that? And in their mind, they viewed it as, we can just slice, and I don't know German, right? It's like a 500 letter word, but basically, it's slicing a hot knife through butter. And that's how they viewed going east.
It's gonna go.
Aaron,
Yeah.
can I offer an opinion really quickly?
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah. Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Yeah, that was a great response. So in the beginning of the war, we know that a lot of the Russian commanders, that were seasoned, were purged by Stalin. So right around 1942, we're getting right now into the phase where you'll have new commanders that are coming up, and now they're basically learning by fire. And now, new commanders are Russian, and they're becoming a little bit more professional than they were. I think one of the reasons also is the fact that that was a big factor, that in the beginning, there was not enough, army soldiers or army commanders that were seasoned enough to fight Germans. And Russia lost, a lot of, aircrafts, lost 18,000 tanks. I mean, it was ridiculous amount of equipment, and they lost it was 2 million soldiers were either lost or given to, were imprisoned, POWs. And Russia went ahead and actually reserved 5 million soldiers, which Germans were not able to do. They resupplied their, and also their background on developing. In 1 year, 1943, there was 28,000 vehicles that was, we were talking about T-34 tanks and stuff like that were thrown into which Germans were not able to match. And, and we know after this war, they were not even be able to go on offensive. Kursk was the last offensive, literally a major offensive that Germans were able to master.
Well, and one thing you can't forget is, and this is sort of one of those like little twists of fate. And the U.S. had one of these also, which is the Red Napoleon, Marshal Tukhachevsky. I probably butchered that, but he established in Leningrad basically, kind of like the war college, or one of the war colleges, basically military academy, and even though he was purged, sadly, because he was obviously he's a genius. I mean, you almost wonder how devastating the German defeat would have been if you had him still around, the next 8 years. So while there was a lot of purging of officers that were, let's say, colonels, barely colonels, but let's say colonels and above, the sort of the guts, right? Your field grade officers, basically your captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, they were pretty much untouched. And that's really important because they sort of kept developing, right? At the same time, they were, you know, pretty rapidly promoted, very much like what happened in the United States, to be honest. It was very similar. I mean, without the purging, of course. I mean, our purging was more like you didn't get promoted, right? Not you got executed. But so having that huge, you know, kind of bulge in the middle of Soviet officers that still sort of learned the great lessons and had the great learning, right? And in the military academy in Leningrad was sort of, there was like a mini, almost like a mobile training unit. Wasn't that cool, but it was sort of like they were put out into large constituent forces. So officers were getting kind of some continuous training. And that was very unique. Whereas the Germans, like everything else, everything had to go back to Berlin. You know, it just had this very central command sort of model, whereas the Soviets were in a lot of ways far more distributed. And that went all the way down into how they taught basically had their continuing education for their officers, which is absolutely essential. And I think it was a huge advantage that the Soviet officers, the big way it had a big advantage is that, you know, the whole concept of the next man up, right? So if a Soviet lieutenant colonel, battalion commander was killed, or a regimental commander, you know, was killed, you just had another one that could come right back up, and they had, you know, almost the same education and sort of understanding. And that just gives you, I mean, that gives you your scalability is what it does, actually.
All right, let's, Hadrian, you want to finish up and then pass the torch to Mr. Aaron on the Russian side? Go ahead.
Yeah, honestly, I was just fascinated by the letters of the soldiers at Stalingrad. And they were, like, I think it's valuable to read these letters because it gives you an idea of what was happening. And yeah, so let me read this one. So this is from a German officer. We have fought during 15 days for a single house, writes a German officer, with mortars, grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. Already by the third day, 54 German corpses are strewn in the cellars, on the landings, and the staircases. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. It is the thin ceiling between two floors. Help comes from neighboring houses by fire escapes and chimneys. There is a ceaseless struggle from noon to night. From story to story, faces black with sweat, we bombard each other with grenades in the middle of explosions, clouds of dust and smoke, heaps of mortar, floods of blood, fragments of furniture and human beings. Ask any soldier what half an hour of hand-to-hand struggle means in such a fight. And imagine Stalingrad, 80 days and 80 nights of hand-to-hand struggles. The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long, only men endure. So I also read that the commissars of inside each Russian unit had forbade surrender, and any man that was trying to desert was shot. There were thousands of men executed in Steingrad by the Russian commissars, and what the Russians did was they would crawl through the sewers of the town, and they would come behind the enemy lines, in houses that the Germans had already captured. And there was heavy fighting going on inside the sewers of the town. Like people would throw grenades at each other and crawl through the sewers. And you also had snipers everywhere. In particular, there was a famous Russian sniper in Stalingrad that killed,
His name is Zaitsev.
Yeah.
Zaitsev, yeah. Which
this
means
guy-
a rabbit in Russian.
So I read that he was so famous that the head of the German sniper school was sent to Stalingrad to kill him. And he ended up dying shot by this Russian sniper. And that Russian sniper killed 11 top German snipers during the Battle of Steingrad. Actually, I don't even know if he died. Do you know if he died during the battle?
Who, Zaitsev?
Yeah.
Zaitsev, I think he was. They were giving him, I think, the honor postpartum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. They made a famous movie about him, Jude Law.
Enemy.
Oh,
yeah.
Enemy at Gates. Yeah, I was gonna ask that question. Is that based on Enemy at Gates? I love that movie with with Ed
Jude
Harris.
Law.
Ed Harris.
Yeah, Ed Harris and
Yeah,
Jude
yeah,
Law.
yeah. Yeah, awesome movie.
What's her name? The British actress was there. What's her name?
Oh,
Schwartz. Yeah.
exactly.
It was an amazing movie, and just
actually
It was Ralph, not Ralph Fiennes, but his brother.
yeah,
Yeah, whatever. It was a good movie. Great movie.
very good movie actually.
Yeah, love it.
It's actually for a war movie was really good, like at a historical level. No, actually, Zaitsev,
Bob Hopkins played Khrushchev, right?
yes, he
Am I
did.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So actually, Zaitsev lived till 1991. He
oh,
lived.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's bringing up the Russian life expectancy in that battle.
Yes, he is.
By several minutes.
Yeah. So he killed 225 enemy soldiers, including 11 snipers in the Battle of Stalingrad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Badass.
serious.
Yeah, badass.
All right, Aaron, you wanna do your part, my friend?
Sure.
And then, thank you, Hadrian. This was good.
Absolutely.
appreciate
And
it.
it's sort of like, we're not doing like a full.
No, it's not a full. I just want general I mean, now you have 75% of the city in Stalingrad being conquered. What's 75%? 90% of the city was conquered by Germans. You have 10% left, and they're literally at the outskirt of the
And
river.
Hitler announced that the town was captured on the radio as well.
Yes, of course he did.
So like,
I mean, I always view him as like one of those really bad CEOs that is just always wrong, and it's just always talking about our product's the best and then it crashes, and that's sort of.
I'm particularly interested. How come Germans were not able to break through, and that Hoffman division could not break through, mechanized division? Yeah.
So one of the things I like to do is sort of kick it into sort of, because we've sort of talked about a lot of it at this point. I mean, one of the things we have to recognize is that by the time the Germans, let's back up. When you have a massive urban conflict, right? It's basically a sponge, right? It sucks your forces in, because what people don't realize, I mean, mathematically, like at a basic geometric level, is that every block, like if you took the same size space as a block, in a field, the amount of forces that you might need are X, to own that what's called grid square. But the moment you're in a urban environment where you have buildings, right? You have these structures that you can't see on either side. You have forces that can fire down on you. So that means you have to take these structures at the highest point, or you have to have the ability to fire at their highest point. You now consume minimum, it's sort of the basic math, is 5 times as many forces, and oftentimes 20 or 30 times as many forces as you would have in a sort of an open field environment. It's something a lot of people just don't sort of intuitively appreciate. But if you just walk around your city and pretended there were 50 soldiers with you, how much of that block could you take? And the answer is probably a couple of the grocery stores on it at best, right? And if that was a field, you know, those 50 soldiers could probably take, you know, that block. And so it's something to sort of understand. And the reason that's important is that the amount of forces that, you know, what do you call it, Weimar forces that got sucked into Stalingrad became so large that you had their allied forces, which were far weaker, Romanians, the Hungarians, the Italians, and that was their exposed flanks. And, you know, and I think there's this sort of strange, over-exaggerated credit that many people give the German sort of strategy and forces, and as good as their small units were, like down to individual soldiers or down into very small units. But I mean, I don't know anyone rationally that would fight a sort of a multilateral offensive into a large urban area and put your weakest
I'm
forces.
sorry, Aaron, how big was Stalingrad at the time? I mean, population, or do you have an idea?
Yeah. So I have this right here. Let me pull this
It's
up.
200,000, right? Population.
Population 19. Let's see. Well, you mean there was 450,000
Okay.
was the population when the battle began. And then obviously the population increased pretty dramatically with the Soviet forces coming in. And so, and of course that's Stalingrad itself, like the greater like Don region is sort of much bigger. And so, you know, if you're kind of rationally looking at it, so the Germans are it's sort of counterintuitive. Like if you really were thinking about this, you would send in your weaker allied forces into Stalingrad first, right? And sort of test the defenses, understand, you know, the parts of the city you'd want to take, right? And that was also part of the problem, is that in a lot of ways, the Germans did not really know how to take a city. And to be honest, very few forces in history have really known how to effectively take a city. Generally, when you try to take a city above a certain size, you almost can't take a city that size because you can't hold. It just requires such an astronomical amount of forces. You know, we've had a recent example of that in invasion of Iraq. You know, it's sort of accepted that at most the U.S. forces had about 15% of Baghdad. And that's not greater Baghdad. If you count greater Baghdad, it's like 5%, if that, probably.
Aaron, but coming back, I mean, how big was Paris? I mean, how?
Yeah, but remember, no one fought in Paris in you know, against the Germans, right? It was they were allowed to walk in. If they had to, if the Germans, I mean, you could make an argument. The French clearly would not make that argument, but that's a different story of the French. That if the French wanted to, I don't know if you'd call it win the war, but let's put it this way, significantly change the course of the war. If they fought the Germans and the Germans decided to be dumb enough to fight them in all of Greater Paris, you know, they could have stuck the German and maybe half the Soviet army into how big Paris is. I mean, the place would be leveled, of course, but.
But what do you think about just destroying every building? Like, how complicated is it to just destroy every building?
Yeah, but it actually is. Trust me. When like I was in an armored, you know, it's like once it's like movies make it look like, hey, go get the satchel bomb. Hey, go get the dynamite with Bugs Bunny and put a cap in it, right? It's like the real world is the amount of energy and forces you need to go in. And by the way, destroying a building isn't always the most effective way to actually take a city block, because many times, based on how you destroy that building, it's going to actually create a whole bunch of small buildings basically crevices that can become new fighting positions, right? So like, to be very realistic, the one reason people don't like fighting in cities is there's buildings with windows and there's corners, right? There's a bunch of basically rectangles.
It's vertical trenches.
Exactly. That's what it is. There's vertical trenches and there's basically a lot of corners, right? Because you have all the structures. Well,
Let's see,
the
like,
moment you
I'm wondering
collapse,
about the.
sorry?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the artillery fire that was like constantly on Stalingrad. Like, I mean, by the end of just the first month, Stalingrad must have been literally just a giant pile of rubble. Like,
That's it. And that is probably, you could make an argument. So if you look at Iwo Jima, which, there's a famous mountain we'll get into one day. It's Mount Karabachi, which is only about 400 or 500 feet high. It took like a month for the Americans to clear out the Japanese out of that mountain, and they built basically a whole bunch of thousands of tunnels and so on. Those piles of rubble were just hundreds of Mount Karabachis spread out throughout Stalingrad. I mean, you'd need 5 million. I don't know if 5 million, maybe 5 million would have done it. I don't know, but it would have been enough. But then how do you feed 5 million and how do you command 5 million? One thing that people forget about Paulus.
Yeah.
Is
what about like using poisonous gas? Like
okay, now you're bringing up, and I'm not like we're all scenario playing here, so we're not advocating the German strategy of World War II.
Yeah, I mean, why did the Germans not do that? Like they had Zyklon B. Like
I mean,
they could have just have brought like a full train of Zyklon B.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there is this weird dynamic with the Germans and the Japanese. Less with the Japanese, because what they the Japanese sort of mass scale experiments and sort of use of chemical gas warfare in China, but overall, neither the Germans or Japanese really implemented, let's call it just standard World War I chemical warfare, right? We're not talking some new generation, space alien version. We're just talking about using what everyone had used 25 years earlier. And so that is something that is sort of a weird thing about how the Germans fought, really, to be honest. Which I would say at a certain point, I don't know why you don't do that. But
I mean, here they say in this article that Hitler was afraid of using it because of his own experience in World War I.
Well, yeah, I mean, the consensus is that for whatever reason, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, but from our brains today, but from their brains then, there was such an experience by almost all the combatants in World War I, and it must have been more psychological than anything else, obviously, that they felt that was just sort of a bond, like a boundary that was too far, which is just weird given all the other horrible things. Pretty much every other horrible thing a human being's ever done to another human being, we did in World War II, except using a lot of chemical warfare, which is just a weird thing.
Aaron, first of all, there was a convention, but the other thing is they no longer had a monopoly on the chemical weapons.
That's true.
They did in World War I, so they knew that if they would start,
it would just keep going.
But then the other countries already had chemical weapons as well.
Yep.
And who knows? I think that was the main thing why they didn't use it.
Well, and obviously, if you
World War I, nobody had chemical weapons except.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a bit strange because on the other hand, they also did like unrestricted naval warfare against the Allies. Like they would just, sink ships and
that's right,
surface the U-boat and kill everyone. I mean, actually, what I understood was that for some reason the Kriegsmarine was probably the most honorable branch of the German military. So I read somewhere that a U-boat that had surfaced and killed a bunch of Allies was actually tried and condemned by the Germans, which was probably the only case where Germans would punish other Germans for war crimes in World War II.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I wonder whether the reluctance to use chemical weapons is related to the fact that it was much greater mobility. in World War II.
I
So
mean,
if you're going to be, if you're making an offensive and you're going to occupy territory, and you put
Right.
gas there, then you can't occupy that territory.
well, I mean, so you
But
bring up a
what do you
very
want to occupy in a pile of rubble, like in Stalingrad, like after a month, you know?
well. So I mean, you bring up something very fundamental, which is, you know, you had a World War I corporal in charge of, you know, one of the, you know, whatever 10, 20 biggest war-making states in history. You had with Paulus, people forget this about Paulus. He was ultimately promoted as 6th Army commander. He never commanded anything above a battalion, actual in-field command. I don't mean that he wasn't granted command, but that he was actually a direct field commander. So he basically had a corporal guiding a battalion commander, which, you know, right off the bat, that sounds like a Laurel and Hardy sketch. But I mean, it's that you had a environment where, in a weird way, just like the Guns of August in World War I, sort of just was this continuation. I think in some ways, while you had mobility in World War II, you had sort of the same mindset that once people started something, they just didn't stop, and they didn't know how to stop. They didn't know how to pivot, shift
Well, I
direction.
mean, you know, think about this. First, Stalingrad, you know, what typified the battle was that the enemies would be so close to each other, right?
Yep.
50 yards apart, you know,
Yep.
the Russians are in the basement, the Germans are on the first floor. So
Yep.
you couldn't use chemical weapons in a situation like that because you'd be hitting your own troops as much as you would the enemy.
Well, but so,
Well,
so
but they did bomb. So they bombed.
yeah,
as
exactly.
well.
So the
Well,
whole
they
point
bombed
is,
it before they moved in.
yeah,
No,
but
no, no, no. They keep
no, no.
bombing
No,
as they
they didn't.
were.
They
kept
didn't
bombing.
bomb this. They didn't bomb the sectors where they were closely engaging with the enemy. They didn't bomb the tractor factory while they were storming the tractor factory.
Well,
Yeah, but they
I read
fired
that-
artillery on it,
Yeah.
and they fired, and that was their attempt at
Yeah, and they
combined
have a
arms.
lot of practice, a huge amount of practice of, and as you, I'm sure you know, Aaron, about, you know, coordinating artillery.
No,
and
I hear
infantry.
you, but when your
But the point was-
communication
but the
lines are
point was-
down,
But the point is that an artillery shell doesn't blow away with a wind.
no, I get that, but you know, the
I
general
think there was
accept,
a lot of friendly fire. Like
there's a lot of friendly
a lot of
fire,
friendly
and
fire,
once
yeah.
you start getting into intense kinetic environments where basically forces are in their own in the engagement zone together. Anytime you're using any field or any type of indirect fire, I mean, the friendly fire, the kind of average in history is about 10%. I mean, that's pretty standard. I mean, U.S. is maybe 5%. We're a little
Yeah, I
better.
mean, like even just bullets can ricochet off walls.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
yeah, at the end of the day, once it was pretty clear the Soviets were going to defend the city, and obviously the Germans never had a plan B because they thought they were the greatest thing in history, and why would anything need a plan B if you already think your plan A is the greatest ever because you're the greatest ever, which, you know, I think speaks to the whole problem from the beginning. Then they really sort of were stuck in a fait accompli because once the Soviets, it was clear the forces that they had massed in those 3 Dons, then you're sort of stuck with either being trapped in this massive urban, right, in a massive city complex, which either sucks you dry or sucks everyone dry, but including you, and there's not a clear winner. And if you don't have a plan B, which is to flank them, you know, to retreat and pull them out and, you know, and confront them in the field. I mean, to just do something else, you're sort of set on this course, which is sort of, you know, what happened in Stalingrad, basically.
Well, speaking in a, you know, of the moving on a little bit,
Yep.
you know, can you get into a little bit more on how
Yes.
they defended the city?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I think one thing to go over, let me go over this too, is just to give you a sense of the scale here, right? So the disposition of forces in Stalingrad on the German side, the Germans had basically, let me get this right here. Hold on, sorry, I have it right here. Nope, one more. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. here we go. So on the German side, you had basically two army groups, Army Group B and Army Group Don. Army Group B had 6th Army, 4th Panzer Army, 3rd, 4th, and 8th armies out of the Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians, and the 2nd Army out of them. And Army Group Don had the, ultimately, which was a future army after, or once it got trapped, that became 6th Army, 4th Panzer Army, 1st Panzer Army, and 3rd Army. So those were the forces on the German side. On the Soviet side, they had the Stalingrad front, the Don front, and the Southwestern front. On the Stalingrad front, you had 5 armies. On the Don front, you had 3, and on the Southwestern front, you had 3. Now, one thing to recognize with how the Germans fought, and I think this is really important, is that the size of their armies was significantly larger than a German army, basically 50% larger. So you had 11 German armies, Soviet armies that were basically equivalent of at least 16 plus German armies. And the other thing is the way the Soviet armies were configured. I had let me go back to this real quick here. Sorry, let me go back to that map I showed earlier. Tell me when you see this.
Paul, I think you wanted to speak, and you're on
Yeah,
mute.
please. Yeah, jump in, guys.
No, Paul was on mute.
Oh, he was? Oh, okay.
And he's talking.
All right, here we go.
Oh, you got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I see. So just, Aaron, I wanted to ask you, are you saying that the Soviet armies, in just their size, were greater than German armies?
Yeah. You mean in terms of just core structure of a German army?
Well, the number of people. And I always had the sense that the Russian armies were smaller, but there were many more of them. That's because the Russians didn't have a core level of command.
Yeah.
And the Germans did. So when you see comparisons, they usually would compare, a Russian front to a German army group, always one down in favor, because the German formations with the same name were bigger.
Well, so what the Soviets did is they basically did what's called the formation process. So they would, this is truly the definition of a meat grinder. They accepted ahead of time that their armies were going to have astronomical losses. So they created this system they called the formation system, where they would go through a first, a second, a third formation of that army. So it's almost like you want to think of the army title as a shell. And then there's an initial set of forces loaded in that shell.
The army probably just represents the administration.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
That's funneling these people through and giving them orders and providing them with weapons and evacuating the wounded.
That's exactly right. And so I'll give you an example. A 28th Army, which is just a regular army. It's a great army, but it's a regular. And it wound up having 4 formations in World War II. It's really almost one a year, or like, let's say one every, it's almost one a year, really, like every 13, 14 months. And so you wound up having this sort of consolidation, right? So as certain armies became, as they disappeared, as they became combat ineffective, like truly combat ineffective, like they just almost vanished because everything was, or a lot was destroyed. The remnants, plus any new forces, plus obviously equipment. By the way, the Soviets were, truly the greatest at what's called warfare cannibalization, which is basically, it's all your equipment cannibalization. So, that also led to why they were so effective, is so much of their equipment was so well designed from a modular perspective. So you could you could hit a T-34 tank, basically destroy its tank turret, but all its rear plates were fine, and let's say its rear track system was fine. There could be a team there, and in less than, like, say 3 hours, that team could basically have cannibalized that tank, and then that becomes spare parts for other cannibalized, and they can basically, construct T-34s, not quite in the field, but let's say in a local depot. And they had that for almost every weapon system that they had. And so you sort of had this modularization of machines, people, units.
It's brilliant Soviet engineering.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, it's historically brilliant. I mean, it really is. So one of the things to look at here, if you see them, does everyone see the map here?
Yes.
Yeah. So you see, this is like within the Stalingrad Don. But then if you go up here, and by the way, this is I can put this in here. It's just someone went to Medium, or built in Medium, a dedicated Medium site that is only doing. Well, that's weird. I don't know.
Who is this handsome guy? Oh, that's you.
That's me. Sorry. It's a picture of my kid. Sorry. Well, that's weird. How come I don't have? Oh, there it is. The chat. All right. Sorry. I thought of it.
I just loved how you tried to pose there. Like.
I had to take. It was a corporate picture I had to take for. You have to do those pictures every so often. So, all right. Here we go. So this is a really good. What do you call it? Site with a bunch of, it's basically almost every map on the Eastern, it is like every map on the Eastern Front, which I think is really cool that they put here. So I haven't found anything that good. So this is obviously, I mean, number one, like this is Stalingrad. This is the battle. Like it's that dense. So when you see here, so let me make this a little bigger. I mean, so you see the size, right? So, if you look here, and I've never been there, so I don't know any of you. I know there's 3 or 4 of you that have, Russian background and or have lived in Russia. I don't know if any of you've ever, been to the region on the Volga and the Don and just sort of,
Yeah, I've been to Volgograd, especially on the Mamayev Kurgan.
Okay.
Are you going to talk about that?
Yes.
Okay.
And so one of the things to recognize here is, and here's the legend for 10 miles. So you can see, while it's a good sized city geographically, to have that many, million people compressed and fighting in such dense pockets, as you can see, you get this concept which is called field compression. Right. So if a unit in front of you is stuck for whatever reason, it doesn't matter how big it is either. Right. Then you basically start compressing all the units behind you, which is one of the reasons you don't want to have field compression. And it's one of the components of fighting in cities that actually makes cities very, very difficult to fight in. If you look at sort of, they'll call it the lessons learned, modern doctrine in fighting in cities, no one invades a city. It's absurd, right? You basically take a little slice of it and start to establish, a sector basically, and you start working. And we'll later talk about how the U.S. went into the Philippines and into Manila basically, and Luzon and other cities, and it's sort of that same strategy, right? You just don't go in and just try to like run over the city. It's almost impossible. I mean, to be honest, the Soviets, when we later talk about, I mean, not today, obviously, but talk about the Battle of Berlin, which I think is a phenomenal battle to talk about. The Soviets sort of fight the right way. I mean, they sort of set the template for how you take a city, literally. And they had obviously astronomical losses, right? I mean, think about it. The Soviets knew how to fight in cities and knew how to attack cities, knew how people defended cities, and they still lost 400,000. Which just tells you, and they were good at it. I mean, probably as good as anyone ever has been. So when you put the larger region in context, all right, so well, that's later, sorry. Yeah, all right, so now you have the larger region in context. So if you look here, this was the disposition of Soviet forces, right? They're actually very intelligently structured in terms of how they're laid out, right? They're not all compressed into Stalingrad, you know. And if you look at the German forces, right, the majority of the German forces, even though there's a lot of their allies, are on the south. But the Soviets are saying, great, come on in. You know what I mean? Like, because one thing to recognize is almost no one on earth is taking this, right? This is a mini Finland here. Like, that's impossible, right? It's just the you know, having that number of bodies of water, the different temperate environments that represents, right, between frozen and non-frozen, the logistics behind it. I mean, that's what makes this whole campaign in this area just sort of absurd. Because, so let's say somehow the Germans took Stalingrad. All right, what do you do now? This becomes a World War I front, basically. Good luck, you know, invading this. I mean, the Germans would keep trying to flank, and, you know, and it'd be a meat grinder here.
Can I pose a hypothetical?
Sure.
There would be a purpose of the Germans being in that position, which would be just to be able to interdict the Volga. Right. So if there had been a German plan to move to the north of Stalingrad, as they did, and just say, okay, now no traffic moves on this river, and hold that while the bulk of the, you know, attack tries to go for broke for the oil fields.
The only thing on that, Paul, is I'm looking at, and this is thanks to Aaron's prior education of us all about supply lines. It looks like if those are railroad lines that I see kind of going through Don, Puskov, etc., that the Russians actually had an excellent network of railroad lines throughout that region as well, that would have made the Volga kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this sort of goes back to this weird combination of the Germans wanting to fight sort of World War I again, but like, you know, tactically in a weird way, getting trapped into this sort of immobile, high concentration of forces. And remember, all the strengths the Germans had were in mobility, maneuverability, combined arms, right? A lot of things Mark just talked about earlier that was a huge advantage. A lot of that stuff just goes away when you get into these incredibly dense environments that the topography is constantly changing. Your communications lines are a train. I mean, they're a train wreck, no pun intended here. And the Soviets, you know, and I think one thing to recognize is sort of the Soviets, one thing they maintained is incredible discipline in their structure of their forces, right? They did this sort of, it's almost like they resource swapped armies, right? So, you know, so they kind of throw another one in, it would get, you know, obviously, you know, almost destroyed, but it would just break down the German army further, and then they throw another one in, and another, you know, they kept recycling them, you know, which obviously at a personal level is pretty horrific, but at a practical level, you know, was sort of genius. And they maintain huge reserves of forces. Let me see, I have another one here. I think this one, yeah. Is this the one? I think this is the one. Let me double check here. Yeah, it's this one here, yeah. So, I mean, this shows you really, you know, sort of the incredible Soviet positioning here, right? It's just like they're like perfectly, I mean, it's like you could literally make a video game on how to defend this, and you would literally put all your forces just like this. I mean, it's when you look at and that's part of the challenge here, is that the Germans got so consumed with fighting here, here I should say, and they didn't really understand the larger position of forces, because if they did and they had any rationale, they would not want to set their battle here. It wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. It just wouldn't. If they were, they would go further north here. You would probably put your battle right here. Like, that's where you want to fight, right? Because you'd want to have the Soviets having to swing all the way around. I mean, it's very interesting. So maybe one day we'll do something on the Civil War. One of the great things I read about this is that Zhukov loved Ulysses S. Grant. And they asked him what his motivation was for this. This was after the war. And he said, Grant's, winning at Vicksburg. And if you overlaid Vicksburg, this is Vicksburg. It really is. I mean, it's actually scary. It almost like gives you tingles. And you realize that the Germans, I mean, obviously a much, 100 times bigger conflict here, but it doesn't matter. They basically walked themselves into a Vicksburg. And so if the Germans had attacked further north, now all those Soviet forces have to move, right? Now you're taking advantage of your maneuver. And as they're moving, right, they're not moving in a consistent way. Now you can flank. I mean, now you maintain all this maneuverability.
And you grab those railroads at a center.
That's right. Yeah, you start changing the context of the fight. But very much like, the Confederacy, right? They thought they had this sort of, monopoly on direction of history on their side, and they couldn't do any wrong. And I would argue that that's a lot of what governed the psychology here.
Aaron, one quick question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'll ask real quick, Zachary. I wonder, were the Russians, most of the Russian forces of that region made up of Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, as opposed to, Northern Russians?
So, you know what, that's let me see. I have a thing here. Let me see. So I know once the battle sort of really took off and sort of like it got to its ugly meat grinder phase, most of those people were actually Russians. So as it got reinforced with Russians, basically, because I think the Soviet Union recognized that obviously this was the fight, right? Not the only fight, but this was going to be one of the big ones.
May I make a comment?
Yeah, please.
As far as I know, the whole Red Army composition, it was never composed of parts or divisions or whatever based on national identity. Yeah. It was all mixed. It was throughout the history of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, actually, Mikhail, it's good you brought that point, but there was a point where a lot of the, from Asia Minor, from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, was composed as separate divisions based on the fact that they, due to the, religion, Muslim religion, all that stuff, they were afraid of a lot of the things that were happening. They weren't allowed to hold the weapon and all that stuff.
Well, go ahead, sorry.
And in fact, in the beginning of the war, they didn't even know what the mine was, and they would gather together around something that was like basically making noise, and the whole, battalion would be exploded basically due to the fact they were not familiar with a lot of this stuff. So due to the fact that not familiarity of it, a lot of the Uzbekistani divisions, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan divisions, they were all the Turkestan, so to speak, were all separated from the, I guess, the familiar with weapons, and that's why, yeah.
Okay, but that could be special case, and I can make another example. There was a Polish contingent and so on, but it was a very small fraction of the millions and millions of the army.
Yeah, so there was a very famous, what do you call it? Kazakh general. I'll probably screw this up too, but Sobir Rakhimov. Rakhimov.
Okay, Rahimov. Okay,
Yeah.
so but yeah.
And he was a 37 Guards, a corps commander. And so, you know, so, you know, the Soviets did a pretty good job, I'd say better than sort of we did, in that their ethnic minorities, they would promote and sort of the unification, you know, of Soviet peoples, right? And so whenever they had a great, you know, commander or someone that won an award, and he wound up getting the what do you call it? The hero of the Soviet Union award. Yeah, the medal. Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, they had examples. I found a site that's basically non-ethnic Russian. You gotta love the Russians, right? Non-ethnic Russian Soviet war heroes, right? So it's like someone put a website up, and it's pretty cool, actually.
Can I give a perspective, like in terms of population?
Yep.
You know, Ukrainians like were like maybe 15-20% of Soviet Union. So in such a major engagement, there is no even remote possibility then majority of them would be Ukrainian.
Yep.
I'm not even talking about that by this time the whole Ukraine was occupied, and part of Ukrainians are collaborated with
exactly the Western Ukrainian.
So I mean the assumption that the Ukrainians could constitute the majority of the battle groups is absolutely out of the question.
Well, I think I know what's going on. I think there was a different fronts that used to be called Belarusian front, Ukrainian front. They're not Ukrainian. It's just a front that used to be called that.
And it's a region where the front acts, where it fights, not who is the contingents composed of.
Yeah, it wasn't ethnical. It was just where they were fighting, and they were called that.
On the other hand, I've seen a couple of documentaries, you know, like Russian documentaries about the survivors of Stalingrad, etc. And it had they had very strong Ukrainian themes to them, where the Ukrainians, the local Ukrainians, obviously, because it was fought on their soil, saw this as a Nazi assault on Ukraine.
But this is the territory of Russia, not Ukraine. It's way out of Ukraine already. And
it's really maybe you're confusing with Sevastopol.
I wonder. Yeah, I wonder who did. Even Sevastopol is Russia, a majority population of Russia.
Well, it was actually Russian up until Khrushchev passed it to Ukraine.
But
the population, majority of population, are Russian ethnic, not Ukrainian. And here, absolutely, I don't know who made this documentary, but I may have been biased. And I personally have nothing against Ukrainians or Russians, you know. But it just like doesn't make any sense that it would be
One more thing. There are statistics available of as far as ethnicity is concerned. How many, let's say, heroes of the Soviet Union were of different ethnic groups, like Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, Tajiks, and so on. And that's available. But they were mixed within their contingent. You could see people of every possible ethnic origin.
Volgograd is part of Ukraine nowadays,
though. No, not even close. It's on the Volga River. It's way out there.
Yeah, it would be a 5-hour drive from the border.
Okay.
Let me just add, though, based on the Holodomor, which I probably mispronounced, you're asking a lot of the Ukrainians to fully support the Russians.
I mean, wouldn't you, for practical purposes, you would say that Rostov is like the hinge of the furthest that you could possibly imagine the Ukraine stretching?
No, Rostov is Russian city.
Completely.
Yeah.
So one thing to
Mariupol is Ukrainian. That's probably the border of Ukraine.
That's the
That's
eastern
probably the
boundary.
border of Ukraine in there. Yeah.
Yeah, but even the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, which is where I think Mariupol is in Luhansk,
Right. The majority Russian ethnic.
Right,
Yeah.
I was gonna say that. Yeah, they literally just fought a war to split themselves off from Ukraine.
Okay.
So one thing I found very fascinating, and I didn't know this, that so I knew that it existed, but I just didn't know its magnitude. So during the Lend-Lease program in World War II, the Persian Corridor, as it's called, supplied basically half of the supplies the Soviets received was through the Persian Corridor. And what's really important—
Yeah, there were. It was actually one of the main reasons why the Shah was overthrown in 1940.
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly right. And so the reason that's important is that's the supply line, right? So, it's literally coming right through here, right? It's coming up either the ships are coming here into the Caspian, and then going on the rail here, or it's coming up through, basically through the North Caucasus rail. And so what made that actually very important is the beginning of the Lend-Lease in 40, which really kind of kicked off in 42, and especially into the summer and into the fall. Basically, the supplies really poured in to Stalingrad. So the Russians, I mean, think about this, which of course the Germans could not have counted on this, and this is back to their genius of scenario planning. They couldn't have accounted for half the supply coming from the south and half of it coming from the north, right? So it's, once again, you're just getting a huge advantage to the Soviet Union. And of course, the Germans are at an extra disadvantage because of their logistics and their supply lines that they have, and that they're stretched out in their 7-front war that they have at this point. They're fighting in North Africa, they're fighting in the Mediterranean, they're fighting, arguably they're defending their coast in France. The French coast, I should say, but at that point it was theirs. And don't forget that they're defending Poland, basically, from a Soviet counteroffensive. Not that that was likely to happen, but if even an irrational German commander would assume that's a risk. So you put all those and that means all those forces need supply. Right. At this point in the war, really, the Soviets need to supply, basically the Moscow sector, and then their Western Front, basically, and then here, and that's it. Maybe a touch in the east, but the east is really
also Leningrad. No.
Yeah, in Leningrad, I would. That's fair. I would say Leningrad also. Yes. So, but that's a lot less to support, and more importantly, getting all this extra support from the south, gives them a huge advantage, because then they really don't have to worry. And there's actually these fantastic cables of, like asking specifically, like, we need X, we need this much wheat, we need this much, and not asking back to Washington, but, through the, or through Basra, because it all came in basically through Basra. So they would actually, customize. It was like Amazon for the Soviet army at Stalingrad. And you can't underestimate how, just on your own side, knowing that, you have that kind of support, and that you also aren't as much of a drain, because that does matter, to other forces in, north of you. So, there was just these things don't seem very big, but when you have forces of this scale, these are just astronomical advantages.
Yeah, and Aaron, just in support of what you just said, the Russian breadbasket is the Ukraine, and it's in the hands of the Germans. So there's a ton of food coming in. They need that food.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And of course, the Germans are sort of in this reverse position, which is, they're in the Ukraine, but they're reinforcing this battle. They have to go and and try to acquire as many resources as they can. Obviously, there's been a pretty big dispossession in the greater Ukraine. So now you know, who's farming, right? I mean, the place is just it's a basket case at that point, right? So it's almost like the Germans have acquired something that costs them more resources, that they can't take advantage of those resources. And now they got to fight a fight that they probably shouldn't be fighting against somebody that's getting completely resupplied. I mean,
and also there is an active partisan movement
yes,
in Ukraine at this point. That
very big, actually, partisan.
Yeah, cutting off supplies.
That's right. It's a very big, and burning fields too, and killing fellow Ukrainians, everything, right? So, no, the partisan. It's very interesting, right? When we study partisan fighting, we tend to like kind of the Italians, because everything Italian we like because it's cool. But maybe the French because it's good movies. But you look at the Ukrainian, you know, partisan fighting in World War II is infinitely larger. I mean, it's a massive force, and of course,
and don't forget the Yugoslav partisans. They actually won their war.
Yes, they did. Absolutely, they completely did.
Tito was the partisan.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Listen, Aaron, I just want to refocus us back to the Stalingrad.
Sorry.
And I have two questions.
Yep.
So Chuikov now basically single-handedly tried to reestablish himself back into Stalingrad. He gets no reinforcements, and they're all the reserves are outside of Stalingrad waiting for something to happen. Was it intentional that let's have Chuikov kind of like cause the skirmishes within the Stalingrad, and then everybody else, you know, and Timoshenko was the head of the whole thing, was, you know, let's just wait outside, and then eventually we'll learn the blitzkrieg from Germans. We're going to do something like that, clearly.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put it in sort of a risk video game mode exactly like the way that you stated it. Don't take offense to that. I would look at it more as the Soviets were pretty practical about what it was going to take to fight in Stalingrad. And so it was very logical to go in with, you know, I mean, when you go into a city, you generally go in with battalion-sized units, and at most you put regiments in sectors, because once again you get what I was telling you earlier, you get that field compression, right? So bigger doesn't always make better, right? It just, especially in cities, it just doesn't work, because you know, you've got a stack of people. If anything, especially if they've got any field artillery, I mean, you're in trouble, right? I mean, you've got all your forces compressed. They can't get out of the way. I mean, it's a nightmare. So I think it boils down to the Soviets, number one, had a more actionable plan in not just defending Stalingrad, but in setting the table for the fight in Stalingrad. And if they could draw in Germans to a large enough degree and basically compress them, they could trap a smaller Soviet force could trap a larger German force in a fight, regardless if you're killing them yet. It's just, you're just trapping them in that fight. And then now you start that sort of replacement cycle effect I was telling you, where you're constantly kind of recycling armies every 2-3 weeks, or, you know, roughly between one army every 1 to 4 weeks was constantly recycled in the whole Battle of Stalingrad.
But were they also attacking the Romanian part of the German?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so down here, so that was actually a great point. So the Russians understood that this was obviously the weaker part of the German allies, right? And so if they could create problems for the Romanians, that would force Germans to have to reinforce them. And of course that means once they're reinforcing the Romanians, what can't they do? That same force can't go into the city and fight that same fight. And so, you know, to be honest, the Soviet tactics here are, you know, I mean, they're textbook and they're studied. I mean, this is just what people study. It's what you do, right? It's why, you know, people study Vicksburg from Grant. It's just like, this is the stuff you do because it works. And the Germans kind of walked into this. It's sort of breathtaking when you think about it, because this wasn't some sort of Einstein physics that they came up with. But it boils down to the Germans didn't respect the Soviets. They didn't, by the way, they didn't respect this terrain and the topography, you know, and you know, if you look at this map here, what's one thing that just kind of becomes really apparent to you? Just no matter what you're looking at.
Size.
Huh?
Size. Somebody said size.
Size is one thing, sure. But what else is there? There's something sort of even more unique about that than the size here.
Exposure. I mean, they're opening.
So if I asked you, and I think everyone here is in the US, if I asked you, where in the United States does a place like this look? What would you probably say?
Well, didn't you already tell us around Vicksburg area?
Well, no. That's the fight. That's the fight.
Okay.
Well, no. Some of it is Vicksburg with the Volga, but overall, this looks a lot like the Great Lakes. Now, if someone told you we're going to go do a massive fight up in the Great Lakes, you'd probably say, is that a great idea? I mean, that wouldn't be the one that leap off your tongue as, yeah, I can't wait for that one. And so there's an enormous amount of water. There's an enormous amount of waterways, which represent, you know, and remember, you have all this water, you have to cross water, right? And crossing water is just, once again, not as simple as people think it is, especially when you have lots of logistics, heavy weapons, lots of troop transports. It just, you know, units that have to be recomposed. You know, when you cross a water, any waterway, you always recompose your unit on the other side to make sure you have everything that you came in to the front side with, right? And so that slows everything down. So, you know, when you look at this, it's just, there's almost no calculus here that makes just make any sense as a fight. And so to answer your question, the Soviets did exactly what you should do. They took a smaller force in, still a big force, but a smaller force in, and they kept prodding the Germans. And then ultimately the Germans, you know, threw the kitchen sink. And of course, you remember what the German philosophy was to fighting. It was tanks, infantry, engineers, artillery, ground attack, air, everything all put together, right? Combined arms. But combined arms, once you start pushing your way in, it starts to become useless at a certain point because of that compression.
Aaron, we don't have a lot of time left.
Okay.
Can we get to the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Polis, that's where the meat of the problem is right now. Go ahead, my friend.
Yeah. So, all right. So let me, so do you want me to,
just keep to the surrender.
Yeah, I'll go to the surrender. So, basically by November, the forces that the Germans were losing was basically unsustainable. So, you know, and I'll give you this. So let me, I have the number here. Let me give me this. Okay, yeah. So the German personnel in the pocket, right, in the Stalingrad pocket, which is this actually. It's not this actually. It's this. So this is how crazy these numbers are. Well, let me get to this real quick here. Where is it here? Sorry. Oh, that's later. No, it's back here. Sorry. Yeah. So, where is it here? Sorry. This one. Yes. So this is the pocket. So the German personnel in the pocket was about 225,000. It was basically 20 divisions. And there was roughly, X tens of thousands of Soviet, civilians at that point. So the thing to recognize is that while this was going on, Army Group A, I mean, this is so insane, continued on their invasion of the Caucasus further south from November 19th until December 19th for that month. So while there was a desperate situation in Stalingrad, the Germans kept attacking in a completely different area that didn't make, I mean, objectively speaking, it didn't make any sense. And so the big thing, of course, was that the biggest fear was that the Soviets were going to, in essence, envelop the Germans, which they were, and that's history, right? But so von Manstein at that point recommended in November that basically that the Germans need to immediately form two defensive fronts and break out one of them, and then have the second one break out so they wouldn't lose all the forces. And of course, Hitler overruled him, you know, and then the whole, you know, died of the last man, field marshal approval, blah, blah, blah. And that's when all, sorry? So now to make it even worse, the Germans actually started to, whenever they could, resupply more forces in. So they actually brought in more forces into the pocket. So you have this tight pocket here. Oh, wait, sorry. No, wait, sorry, I went the wrong way. Sorry, I have so many good maps here that I lose the map. Oh, there we go. So, so the Germans, you know, I mean, obviously their force structure at this point is like, they're like here, really. And they bring more forces in to resupply. So in the end, they brought another 50,000 in, which of course they just, you know, faded them. So then the end of the battle was von Manstein, and I don't know how many of you know about Operation Winter Storm. That was he finally convinced Hitler that the goal was to try to establish a corridor and to be able to fight them out of that corridor. But that proved, and it was going to be very large. You can make an argument that could have been a set of more decisive battles, you know, if that happened in early 43, because the scale of forces von Manstein wanted to put together and that he was going to lead, you know, was going to be pretty substantial. It was basically going to be, you know, and it was going to be 4 armored corps, you know, with a tank corps and another, you know, 5 mechanized infantry corps. So it's going to be a pretty large force, actually. So thank goodness that didn't happen. And then so one of the other things to recognize is that while this was all going on, the Red Army High Command was constantly, you know, it was classic psychological warfare. They were broadcasting you know, the surrender, you know, you'll be treated well. You know, we have food, we have bread, we have wine.
Oh, yeah. Actually, about that, they had
go ahead,
broadcast.
Please. Yes.
Yeah. So they had a broadcast which was in German. It was every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies at Stalingrad. Tick tack, tick tack, and they would just put this on all day.
Yep. And so the Soviet Red Army offered 3 different times, or they had 3 different envoys that they sent from the high command, you know, to General Paulus, to his high command, to offer surrender. And you know, and of course Paulus, you know, requested permission to surrender, which he was obviously rejected. The German high command, you know, basically told him that every day the army holds out longer helps the whole front and draws away Russian, you know, divisions from it. which is sort of absurd, but whatever. And the thing to recognize also is obviously the Germans were starving to death too. I mean, and exposure, but they were also running out of, you know, pretty much everything you could use to fight with, right? Ammunition, you know, any kind of shells, explosives. I mean, really anything you needed. And if there is sort of this interesting dynamic, which is, and this is sort of one of those random things, is that in World War I, which had a lot more, on average, sort of trench warfare, you know, bayonets, you know, this sort of fire, you know, the old saying, it's like you fire 4 times and then you stab 10. That was sort of one of the lines.
You make me sick.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry, Mark? Nope. Mark, are you there? Or did Mark ask something?
No, nobody. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, so the Germans weren't well trained in that at all, actually. So, not that probably would have made a huge difference, but you know, like they didn't even have that sort of, we can do a kamikaze raid on you, you know, all out assault. That just wasn't really in their, in their vantage point. I mean, in some ways they were, I'm not gonna, it's oversimplifying to call them a one-trick pony, because combined arms is pretty revolutionary. But they were really designed to be this highly mobile, high maneuver warfare fighting machine, not this trench, hand-to-hand fighting, you know, urban maneuver fighting war machine. That really isn't what they were designed for. And more importantly, they didn't have any of the command and leadership that could, you know, that could do that. And so, so basically, you know, what it boiled down to is once Paulus didn't accept the terms, the Soviets basically, you know, launched basically a massive artillery barrage and airstrikes, right? You had the Zuka bombers. I mean, you had, you know, and it was pretty clear that really all the lines were basically shattered, right? And they were all falling. And then basically Paulus, you know, surrendered with his chief of staff, Schmidt. You know, and that was that basically. So
Okay.
he had 22 generals surrendered. It's the largest surrender of generals in history at this point. I mean, except for the end of the war, obviously, the end of World War II.
Aaron, can I interject a little bit
Sure.
and give you a little slice?
Yeah, please.
When I was in Volgograd, it's called Volgograd right now.
Yep, of course.
You know, there is this place called Mamai Kurgan, which is where everybody comes to pay respects,
Sure.
and this is like the center of reverence for the people died. There is a huge monument there, very famous for. And the reason it's famous for is because during the Battle of Stalingrad, the most intense fighting was around that Mamai Kurgan. Kurgan means hill, basically. Yep. So it's elevated. And it was taken like a few times back and forth by Germans, by Russians. So a lot of people died there. So the idea is that why is it called Mamai Kurgan? You know, because I know if you know in the Russian history in the 14th century, there was very famous general that controlled Golden Horde in the 14th century by the name of Mamai. And he established the fort there to control Volga River. And it's an outpost because a little bit south in the Volga River, there was the capital of Mongol Golden Horde called Sarai. There were a few of them, Sarai Batu and Sarai Berke. So the other perspective I'd like to give you is why Russians fight so hard, why they don't surrender against all odds. And the thing is that it's a perspective on the Russian history. So ever since the foundation of the Russian Empire is really Moscow Principality that was founded in the 15th century. And since foundation, there was 3 major invasions. There was existential. The first one in the beginning of the 17th century by Poland. They took Moscow. It was like a multiple invasions. And then, of course, Napoleon and this World War II. And what happened really, it created the popular uprising. Even back in 17th century, the famous popular uprising of Minin and Pozharsky. There is a big statue on the Red Square right now. So the Russians really have a history and a tradition of resistance with a popular uprising. And that's what Stalin tapped into, because honestly, the campaign of patriotism, it was so tremendous in Russia that even though I was not living at the time, but the remnants of that propaganda reached even my generation, and it was tremendous. There is songs that really, if I hear it right now, I will have a goosebumps. So just wanted to give you a perspective that since that time, since 15th century, the idea of a grand state and the patriotism and the popular resistance. That's why, by the way, as you know, partisan campaign or guerrilla war that usually happened during the Napoleon time, very famous. Obviously, during the Polish invasion at the beginning of the 17th century, and clearly in the Second World War II, is a result of that national kind of national movement. That's all I want to say. Just
Yeah,
to
no,
give you
that's great. I want to
on,
bring up the picture. I have the picture of it,
Yeah.
and I forgot to bring it up. So let me
Also,
just the
Adrian,
perspective of the spirit
Yeah,
of patriotism that
absolutely.
exists
Let me
in
bring this
Russia
up.
is
Let me-
tremendous.
Okay, so while Aaron's bringing up the picture, let me push back just a little, because approximately 1 million Russians surrendered in 1941. Once they found out that the Germans were even worse than Stalin, they fought to the death. But initially, they weren't having a problem surrendering.
I'm only talking about spirit. Of course, there are all kinds of things, but ultimately, Russia has been invaded. There were major invasions, existential invasions, and they always managed to survive.
Yeah. So here's the hill. And so this is sort of the, and it's really important to recognize that in near river areas, small hill advantages in topography are very strategic. Obviously, a couple of great commanders like Duke of Wellington and Napoleon understood that, pretty effectively, especially because you can rain artillery fire down. It gives you a huge vantage point. And so, that represented, that hill. And so it was in September 14th, 42 that the Germans captured the hill. They took very heavy casualties. And then on the same day, the Soviet 13th Guards Rifles Division, commanded by Alexander Romitsev, and then he turned around and assaulted that division. That hill. In the beginning of the 15th, and recaptured it on the 16th, and they took massive losses. So the Germans reassaulted it 12 times a day, and the Soviets counter-assaulted it. So it changed hands at least 6 times. By the 27th of September, they captured half of the hill. Right, that's usually what happens to hills. Right, I mean, the hill is where everyone goes to die. Which is another reason why you don't want to fight on hills all the time. So this is pretty interesting. So they calculated, because obviously this is what you do when this is something so strategic. that that by the end of the war, that hill had 1,250 splinters of metal per square meter. So if
Oh
you
my
think of
God, per
what a
square
meter
meter.
is, yeah, square meter is pretty small, right? It's
Right.
basically a box. It's a small
Yeah.
box, and so basically the whole hill is just littered with metal splinters from all the artillery that was fired on it. So so yeah, there's a very famous memorial complex. It has the eternal flame. It looks pretty. Actually, looks really beautiful. So I'm sure those of you that visited, and one day I'd love to go see it. It's yeah, it's got it has a very famous monument designed by Yevgeny Viktish, and it's called the Motherland Calls. It's 100.
You have a picture of it?
I'm sorry?
You have a picture of it?
Yes, I'll pull that up. Yes, absolutely.
And also, while you're pulling it up, if anybody have any questions or want to add anything, we can use like 10, 15 minutes and, ask questions. One particular question I have is, Goering famously promised to Hitler to supply Polish troops, and obviously he was not, was not able to live by his promise. How much of the reality that Hitler lived in, having to see this, the army being surrendered, and obviously Poland asking to withdraw for that sake. How much of reality that Hitler lived in, Aaron?
I mean, it's clear that these are like cult of personality kind of complex. It's almost like saying, how much reality did Pol Pot have? It just at a certain point, these guys are living in these delusional states that are, people are telling them what they want to hear. People hear what they want to hear. I mean, it's just, you're surrounded by this sort of mythical personality, basically, at that point. Oh, yeah, here we go.
Yeah, Aaron, let me add, you're absolutely right, because Hitler only listened to Goring when it was to his advantage, just like at Dunkirk. If Goring told him something he wanted to hear, he listened.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of, I mean, that's basically who he is, really. Oh, here we go. Let me pull this up here.
Anybody else wants to? This is Wednesday is a free for all, guys, discussion.
Hey, let me ask Aaron a question.
Yeah.
Sure.
How much do you think the title of Stalingrad had something to do with Hitler's mindset? Because he couldn't take Moscow and he couldn't take Leningrad, but this was actually the city named after the guy who was running the war. He'd like to take something. Do you think that had anything to do with Hitler's extreme effort to take this city?
Absolutely. I think it's fundamental. I think it just, Hitler saw the world in this way, which many people did, right? I mean, it was almost this very 19th century, 18th century sort of worldview that, once I hit you and your imagery loses and, blah, 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 then you cave, then you fall, right? And I think that's sort of that point of view that he had. And I guarantee you, if it was named, if it was named Volgograd, not that it wouldn't be on someone's war plan, but so this is the inside of, and I can't obviously read Russian, so anyone that can tell me what it says up there.
Mikhail, can you see? Where? I don't know.
The eternal flame, see up here?
Yeah, I can. You mean up there? It says that those who survived from all of us, but we paid our we did our what we were supposed to do. We paid our dues.
So
doesn't make sense. Where is it?
Well, it's not the whole thing. It's only.
No. I wanted to show you the inside. I just wanted to show you.
Did you make it up, Greg? What the hell?
No, I'm just reading.
Where is it? I don't see it. Where is it? On top? Oh, okay.
On top. Those, but it's only half the phrase. I mean, that's all what I could read.
I wanted to show you just that one picture, because one of the cool things about it is it's open 24 hours a day. So it's like kind of like the tomb of the unknown soldier in the United States and DC. So, you know, obviously this is sort of you know, it's obviously it's like a religious, you know, at a sort of a nation state level, right? And so one of the other things that's interesting about it is that so the construction uses concrete, and I'll show you there's a famous sword out there also, but it's and it's basically modeled, like all of this is modeled after the Greek representation of Nike, and so you know, as sort of forever, you know, what do you call it, immemorial. So that's, you know, that I thought was pretty cool. Let me I have another couple of these. Let me pull
the translation is a small amount of people survived. That's the first one. Malakto Tsilil. And we achieved our patriotic goal. That was the translation.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Because the first word is hard to see.
Right. Okay.
all right.
Can you show it from outside? I mean, it's a
Yeah.
huge
That's what I'm
monument.
doing.
Yeah.
I'm pulling it. There's so many. The problem with this, like a lot of things in life, there aren't a lot of pictures. This has a lot of pictures, so I'm having to hold on. Let me pull this one up here too. So.
And also, I want to play Hadrian's Katyusha. You know, I guess Hadrian, that was firing Katyusha.
Yeah.
You can share it, by the way. Aaron, do you want him to share it first quickly, and then you can share yours?
All right. Let me just show you
Go ahead.
one of these on the outside real quick, and then I'll pass it to him to share.
I keep looking at this handsome man. What the hell? Who's
Yeah, yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah.
And you see the people there?
Yep.
All the small things.
Yep.
Wow, that's huge.
It's huge. Yeah, it's 165 feet is the sculpture, and the whole, and then when you count it with the blade and everything else, it's about 270 feet.
Ooh,
and
wow.
The sword is about 90 feet, basically 91 feet. And supposedly, and I've never been to Volgograd, but I'd love to, is that it sort of dominates the sky, right? Like if you're there, it says
you could see it from almost anywhere in the city.
Yeah, exactly.
wow.
That's in Mamai Kurgan, right, Greg?
Yes, it is. That's the one I was talking about.
Yep.
Wow.
And what they said is, you know, the Tartar Golden Horde in the 1370s, you know, it's believed sort of mythically that
established the fort, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that the leader, which if Richard's still here, he can correct it, but Uleg Ulsis is.
Which empire is this?
No, Juchi.
Oh, Jochi. Yeah, Jochi.
Juchi or Ulysses. That was the oldest
Yes.
son of Genghis Khan.
Well, Ulus was the tribe.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
So it's believed that fort was there, and that obviously they're buried there, and so, you know, it had that, you know, that mythical, you know, it really is sort of, the more you read about it, it's kind of like a Greek, you know, or Roman level sort of mythos there, which is really amazing, especially given that it's not even 80 years old, right? You know, so the fact that it's within, you know, lifetimes that there's something that's created like that in the modern world that you can still sort of, you know, connect to, and that, you know, a few people are left living still.
The woman is a representation of the motherland.
Yes.
Aaron, I had a quick question about one of your maps.
Okay.
The one with
hold on a second. So ask that, and I'll pass it over to Hadrian.
Right.
Yeah, Hadrian, you can share after a question.
Yeah, and I'll make it quick. I figured that would be
No, that's fine. That's fine.
intrusive. The one with all the arrows on it, the little arrows.
Yep.
The thing that amazed me about that map is when I first looked at it, I assumed the black arrows were the Nazis.
Yep.
invading, but it's
Yep.
not. The legend said the black arrows are the
It's
Russians.
Soviet attack. Yeah, yeah.
So is it that the Nazis got in there and then the Russians attacked them? So they were
That's exactly right.
They were oddly in an offensive and then defensive position, and then the Soviets swarmed all over them, it looks like.
Yeah, so what the Soviets did, and then after Adrian plays, I can show you the map, is that, and actually the legends, I mean, this is a really good map of sort of, you know, it's probably the best one I found that goes into sort of something this large, but has made it sort of digestible. Is that basically what the Soviets did is I mean, this is literally what you're supposed to do, right? They surrounded, they let the Germans in, then they boxed them in with their infantry, and then they surrounded their infantry with artillery, which is exactly what they did. And then that's basically, you create what's in small unit terms, like when you're in a squad or a platoon or a company, you're trying to design these, what are called kill boxes. And that's literally what it is. It's a kill box. And they just built the largest kill box in human history, the biggest one that'll ever get created, unless aliens land or something crazy like that. But, you know, you'll never have a kill box with a couple million people in it, you know, in the history of the world.
Contemporary boxing terms, it was rope-a-dope.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you.
Yep.
Does anybody have, before the Hadrian is pulling up the question, this is discussion mode. Sergio, Rolf, have any questions? Mark, who else is on?
No, I'm very impressed with everything. I think it's a great presentation.
Rolf, any questions, my friend, or Leonid?
No, just to clarify that last point. Yeah, I had also thought those black arrows were the Germans attacking, but so the Soviets then had a pincer movement from the south and from the north to completely surround it.
Yeah. So what they did is they choked off the resupply lines on the Don, because the Don is pretty wide at many points, at the flattest points. I've never been there, but those of you that have been there, I mean, it's not a little river, right? It's not the Hackensack River where I live in New Jersey, right? It's a, you know, it's basically, it's wider than the Hudson River. So, you know, those are complicated things to cross. And so once they choke those off, then the Germans resupply was toast, and then they can just encircle and attack. And that, which is another reason, you know, going after Stalingrad's insane, is that to your rear is a big river.
Yeah.
Right.
And
like,
I think they left the supplies behind the Don, and that was their mistake. By the way.
Well, yeah. Well, at a certain point, you're so compressed, how it becomes hard to set up supply lines when, you know, that's another problem when you get this compressed, is that if you set up your supply lines so close to you, right? People, it's counterintuitive. It actually takes you longer to allocate your supplies, because it's in such a dense environment and everybody is sort of packed in camps. So it's actually, you tend to want to have your supply lines having some distance so that the disposition can be set up in a way, you know, you can set it up like an Amazon warehouse, right? I mean, it's like, imagine an Amazon warehouse dropped all over the city, right? It'd be trying to resupply that would be a train wreck, and try to have people coming in and out, right? It would, imagine if there was 40 Amazon warehouses in the city, right? It would just be a nightmare. Whereas they're all in New Jersey.
It sounds like the Nazis, once they got in there, which was questionable as a maneuver.
Yep.
Once they got in there, they failed to secure the perimeter of the city, in essence.
Well, yeah, and the amount,
and
the amount of, exactly, how could they? The amount of forces they would need are just so astronomical.
I mean, the whole thought behind that is like, once they got in there, what were they going to do?
That's right.
Well, I mean, I thought, in fact, that they came very, very close, extremely close to occupying every square foot of Stalingrad.
I mean,
there were times when Zhukov had to move his headquarters.
Yeah, no, I mean, look,
to the escape gully. So they were down to, you know, to in extremis.
Yeah, but the advantage the Soviets had is this recycling effect on their army.
Absolutely, but I'm saying that there were the Germans did come, objectively speaking,
Yeah.
came close to having 100% occupation of Stalingrad.
Were there any Russian civilians left in the city at the end?
At the end.
I think in the end it was really tiny, like down to a few thousand,
But
right?
Stalin made a point of not evacuating the citizens.
Right.
Right.
Okay, but this is what I heard on that or read on that was basically he didn't get that order out in time. The civilians just left on their own. They got out before the major fight.
Well, yeah, and civilians are pretty good at figuring out bad things are coming usually, and they tend to try to leave. Like humans are pretty good at that as like a species. It's kind of like birds and other pack animals, right? So
that picture, that photo you showed too, Aaron, was really helpful of the hill.
Yep.
You know, and you see that you're not talking about New York,
nope.
Or Chicago. You're talking about basically a river port town.
Yep.
Very spread out. So I can see how the center of Stalingrad, anybody with any sense would have gotten the heck out of there.
Yeah.
Civilian.
All right, let's play Hadrian video first, and then we'll continue discussion. Sorry, guys. Hadrian, go ahead. You can share.
Okay. Share. So do you see my screen?
Yeah, SQL statement.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know you're a SQL guy. That's cool.
Okay. So this is the Katyusha rocket launcher.
By the way, if you want to play it loud, take off your headphones, because otherwise we won't hear it. If you want us to, yeah.
Oh yeah, good point. I always forget that people always forget that. That's a good one.
Meaning, like, yeah, go ahead.
Wait, I just need to, yeah.
Это вам за сегодняшний автобус. За всехний автобус. Внимание всем машинам, огонь!
I want one of those for Christmas.
Yeah, so wait, can you hear me or?
Yep, yeah, no, we can hear you.
Yeah, so what I meant to say is so in 1942, so during basically around the Battle of Stalingrad, the Russians had 3,700 of these. Usually like a firing team would be, you would have like 4 trucks, 4 Katyusha trucks, and then 2 reload trucks and 2 support trucks. And they could fire in 10 seconds. They could fire the equivalent of 4 tons of explosives across an area that's, I think, 400,000 square meters. So it's a very large area. And it's basically equivalent to the payload of 72 artillery guns. And what they would do is they would fire in like 7 seconds, and then they would take the truck, drive away so that they could avoid a counterstrike. They would drive like 10 kilometers, and then they would reload, and it would take like 3 or 4 minutes to reload. And then they would come back and fire again. So they would have like, I don't know how many they had at the Battle of Stalingrad, but they might have had, you know, maybe as many as 1,000 on the eastern side of the Volga.
Yep.
And these trucks would just cycle in and out, fire, you know, enormous amounts of rockets in a very short burst. And these weapons killed a lot of Germans. Like in the diary of the German soldier that I shared, he says that like 50 men in his unit were killed in one day by Katyusha rockets. So, yeah.
Now, these were the same American Ford trucks that were made by
probably a lot of the
no, the majority of them were, because they came in from the south, so these were all brought in on rail and basically mounted. And that was a great point you brought up. I forgot I read about that, which is the Soviet engineers gave the U.S. Engineers that were in the Army and the Navy the specs, and what they would do is the trucks on their way over, because they all were shipped, they would prep the trucks, right? They would basically drill and have them ready. So by the time they literally came in, to Greater Stalingrad or to the region, from a supply perspective, they would then get mounted and then driven to the front. I mean, it was, almost instantaneous. I mean, it's sort of incredible when you think about it. And they could just, have them ready. And oftentimes the rockets. So one of the things the U.S. would provide would be a lot of the what do you call it, phosphorus and sulfur oxide that's needed to as propellant, and so the U.S. would literally bring one of these trucks in with like canisters of this on the back, and then they would mount everything, basically load the rockets, and drive them to the front and fire them. I mean, it was just, I really don't think you've ever had that kind of supply response to a fight in history. I mean,
and I think that's one of the major reasons how the United States became such a world power afterwards. I mean, their production quality and scale, that they're able to produce things on that level matched no one at that time. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I would say the way the Soviets could engineer incredibly effective, but with incredible simplicity, awesome, very resilient, and that was really the key. Is that the Soviets kind of wouldn't cheat. Right, they wouldn't cheat on their quality. Like, they wouldn't cut corners, at least on this. I mean, I'm sure they cut corners on a lot of other stuff, but at least when it came to this, they were very, very quality conscious.
What really was so unique about the Soviet weapons was this kind of elegance of design.
Yep.
Because it wasn't, in terms of just pure quality of engineering, nothing matched the Germans.
Yeah.
But the design, stepping out, thinking outside the box,
yep,
is what the Soviet weapons.
Exactly.
I used to paint little tanks. I was a war gamer.
Yep.
And just to say that you paint a German Tiger tank, you'd have to sit there and get the brush into every nook and cranny. You take a T-34, you take the brush, it's whip, 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 right? It's painted.
Yeah. I just want to give one quick point. Apparently, the design of Katyusha may have been influenced by Giuseppe Fiacci machine Infernale. And, obviously, he was honored at a religious service in Moscow. But interestingly enough, Leonardo da Vinci had a similar machine, obviously a design type of machine in the 15th century. And then Gennady Kotskov invented the Katyusha based on Giuseppe Fiacci machine. So talking about Italians, this was an Italian design.
Well, it's actually very, you could see sort of siege gun type thinking. As I had a great history professor in college that said, if you don't know an answer of when something was created, there's always two simple answers to everything: Leonardo da Vinci and the Chinese, right? You just say those two every single time and you're right at least half the time, right? So,
I have a, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
What was the outcome once that the battle was won? What was the real outcome of this? And what do the Germans, were they staying in as prisoners, or what happened?
Well, so at the German level within Stalingrad, basically the majority of those soldiers either died, or the handful that lived, they basically served a gulag-like prison sentence for 10 to 15 years, something like that. And I think it was 14 or whatever. Well, they were.
Hadrian said it. They most returned. Only 5,000 survived, and most returned in 1950s.
Exactly.
And what's interesting, Paulus.
The number that I heard was that they were 90,000 German prisoners in the surrender.
Yep. Yeah.
Right.
But
Right.
I think it's actually the first major defeat of German forces. Like really major.
There is an interesting fact about
Paulus.
Paulus.
A lot of historians believe that this is the turning point of the war.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, there's an interesting point about the Paulus. He was used as a propaganda machine for Soviets.
For the Soviets.
He actually wrote memoirs in the 1950s, where he completely denied that he lost the battle. He was just saying that it's because Hitler didn't reinforce his forces. It was not his fault and stuff like that. So there was interesting memoirs he wrote, but he was used as a propaganda machine. Lived in GDR, which is the Democratic Republic of Germany.
Yep. And so the other thing to recognize is that so this happened. I mean, this loss basically happened at the same, or very close to when El Alamein happened. So you had the Germans basically thrown out of North Africa and beginning kind of this, assault across the Mediterranean. And their fully stretched, southern campaign, which is sort of absurd. I would argue that one's equally as absurd, not as significant, but equally as absurd as this one. And then this began that same pushback, to that the Germans had. And of course, like I was saying earlier, the war went on an additional, 26 months, I think. And so it tells you a fighting defensive force can fight for quite a long time, and you need an enormous amount of forces to sort of defeat them. And I think that's an advantage the Soviets had is, you could sort of make an argument objectively until D-Day. Basically, the Allies sort of fought a junior version of this campaign, in North Africa and through the Mediterranean and into Italy. And then sort of, let's call it a mid-level version of this campaign, through France. So, and the difference is the Soviets fought like 3 of these campaigns, in the East, right? So, it was, extremely large. So
now, does this photograph represent more or less all of Stalingrad, or was this one particular area?
Yeah.
How characteristic was?
Oh no, this is very characteristic of Stalingrad. Like this is really sort of what it looked like. I mean, this is a bombed out moonscape, basically.
Stalingrad had several distinct different neighborhoods.
Yes.
So the north of Stalingrad was a factory neighborhood, and it was dominated by the tractor factory.
Yep.
There was this kind of a downtown in the middle, where you have that famous hotel.
Yep.
That famous scene. And in the south, there were residential areas.
Right. Well, it's an interesting fact that just to show how crazy the battle was, the Stalingrad, they said in the building of 4 stories, the first 2 stories could have been occupied by Germans, and the top 2 stories are occupied by Russians. That's how crazy a compact of the fight that was.
Oh yeah, there's also, and I forgot about this, I didn't show you. It's not as awesome, obviously, but there is also, and I don't know if you went to this, there's a memorial at the tractor factory, which on principle doesn't sound quite as fun and sexy as the as the hill that has the Mongols on, but yeah, there's a memorial there also. So they basically rebuilt. I mean, it's so Soviet, right? They rebuilt the factory and they just kept like the front part, like the memorial, basically. So.
And right near the factory, there was a very famous granary, which was a strong point, and it was bound.
There's a huge strong point there, absolutely.
Aaron,
yeah.
I was stunned by how many generals you said were captured.
Yep,
I mean,
22.
From having been in the military, generals just don't go down. I mean,
well, the idea is that it was an army, so it was the complete staff of the army.
Exactly.
In the army, there are corps,
Yep.
generals in command of the corps, and having chiefs of staff, and under them divisions. Once again, generals with chiefs of staff. So you got a whole bunch of generals when you have a whole army structure.
Did you say 37, Aaron?
22 generals.
22 is a lot too. I mean,
That's a pretty big number.
Unbelievable. That also is evidence of the commitment they had to the battle.
Yeah, absolutely. You
A
know,
division is commanded by general, right?
yeah, usually
Yes.
it's a 1 or 2 star in charge of a division, and then usually a 2 or 3 star in charge of a corps. And then
You really don't see, colonels until you get to, regiments.
Yeah, regiments and brigade levels is where you get. But yeah, so and then this was a picture just on another Wednesday in the fight, right? So it was just, I mean, you could see this is a different picture of Stalingrad. So you could see the moonscape quality to it at this point. I mean, this was, I mean, I don't know if, from everything I've read about Dresden, that was a pretty leveled place too. But I mean, this is definitely up in the annals of places that have been leveled in history, or at least in World War II history, which is probably the majority of leveling that's happened.
Wow, this is crazy.
And then I found there's a really good site here. It's called War on the Rocks. It's kind of random, but it's pretty good. And they have I'll put
in discussion mode.
I'll put that in here.
In a weird way, it's a sort of Russian Gettysburg, or in
No, it is.
where it's just the two forces met and obliterated everything involved, and it's a stunt. I really appreciate this, Aaron and Hadrian, because I never realized how stupid the Germans. I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, I'm sure they're smarter than I am, but still, to have gotten themselves in a cage, basically.
That's right.
With nowhere to go. They couldn't go across the river, like you said, because that was nothing but more Russian forces.
Right.
And they couldn't retreat at that point.
And if you look at this, there, and this is the chief of the German High Command, Franz Heidler, in his diary. It's becoming ever more apparent. Let me see if you guys can see this here. There we go. You guys see that or no?
Yeah, we can see. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, becoming ever more apparent that the Russian Colossus has been underestimated by us. Right. That's a statement of the millennium. At the start of the war, we reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now that we have already counted 360, when a dozen has been smashed, and the Russians put up another dozen. So this tells you, right? I mean, the scale of what they trapped themselves in, and also, don't forget that the Germans were so insane. They were launching these continuous operations in other sectors. I mean,
I have a question for you. Yeah. Could you talk about the penal battalions? So I read that the Russians took they basically emptied the jails. So they took the murderers.
Oh yeah, the
front lines at Stalingrad.
Yeah. So they actually had a Soviet penal battalion. So which I mean they had this. I mean, and to be honest, it felt very medieval, right, or kind of Mongolish. They basically promised them if they could fight I'm trying to get the line right. It was something to the effect of if they could fight to the death and live, then they'll be freed and be given a dacha on the Caspian Sea or blah, blah, blah. And obviously probably very few lived.
Dacha is a villa.
Yes, yeah, a villa. Exactly. They'd get.
But what's interesting about that also, there was some population that was deported, like Tartars from Crimea was deported.
Yes.
And they were not actually in the penal battalion. They were fighting normal forces. But when they came back home, there was nothing. I mean, the whole population was depopulated, deported to Kyrgyzstan.
Yep.
And it was disgusting what Stalin was doing. But they were still fighting for and bleeding for Russia.
Yep.
And knowing that this was happening.
I don't know. Is it a myth that the penal battalions were used to clear minefields? just by walking through it and
So
clearing the mines by
I know
sending
that
them off?
so the penal battalions at the beginning of the war, they took regular units as anti-retreat units. So if the
Yeah.
penal battalion was retreating, you would shoot on them. But
Yeah.
then the regular troops didn't want to do this, so they actually had a special unit called like the Smersh or something.
Smerch, yeah.
Yes,
Smerch.
Smerch,
yeah.
which was
It's
a unit
abbreviation. Yeah.
they literally just dedicated to shooting guys that were retreating from the front lines.
So a couple interesting things that they did is and I guess the Russian name is, you'll correct me, but it's Schriftbad. Is that it?
No, it's Strafbad. Straf means penalty.
Okay.
May I clarify this?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there are three separate things which are mixed in our conversation now.
Okay.
Strafbad, it means like Zach says, it's like penal contingent. It's people who were
Battalion.
sent. First time I heard that they were promised dacha or something like this, they were just the best they could hope for was they would be, after some heroic fighting, if they are not killed, they would be moved back to normal contingent from this penal contingent. That's the best they could hope for. Nobody would promise them anything else. Secondly, there was so-called Zagrad battalion, which means kind of back fence or something like this, which were so when contingent goes to fight, from behind it is followed by another contingent who, if these people start going back or retreating, they would be killed. And they know about it. So the only way is way forward.
And what they did is they took officers. So it was very interesting. They took officers. Remember we talked about Order 227. So officers that violated the Order 227, which often meant they just didn't shoot their friends. You know, they were put in as officers in these units, but they also put in recovering non-commissioned officers, right? Ones that were injured or, you know, were still recovering, et cetera, so that they could provide sort of like the infrastructure, right? The NCOs provided the infrastructure. So, and just to bring up the scale of this, there was the estimate is 422,700 members. So roughly 500 battalions, right? That's kind of not a joke. That's a pretty decent sized force and that's over, you know, from 42 to 45. So basically over 3 years of the war. So that's, you know, one more of these layers of advantage, right? A free, you know, 30 divisions that the Soviets had that as an advantage, you know.
And then the third part is which is called SMERSH. This is abbreviation, which is in Russian with abbreviation of words death to spies.
Yep, death to spies. Yep.
And that would mean it's basically a division of KGB, military division of KGB, who would be again doing what KGB was generally doing.
All the good stuff, like giving flowers to people.
Right, exactly, yeah.
All right, before you guys drop out, I just want to remind of upcoming presentation. Next week, Wednesday, we have Plutarch, Pericles. So if you can, please read or listen to the book, whatever you guys do. And that, you know, that would be a normal time at 7. But this Saturday, we have an exciting presentation on Phoenicians, which is mostly would be Rolf and Greg. Rolf is going to talk about a little bit of, about Phoenicians and also seafarers and the language and alphabet. Mostly Rolf, yeah. And then Greg is going to add Carthage and the myth of, development of Carthage and a little bit about
myth and
foundation myth.
Early history of it.
And then I will, if the time permitted, I will talk a little bit about child sacrifice and Phoenicians, which is probably going to just be one slide. If if time permitted. And the most
Come on,
famous
we don't
one.
want to do a whole bunch of child sacrifice.
Wait, I just have
Well, go
one
ahead.
question. It's
I'm
just,
joking.
Go ahead.
is
Go
it
ahead.
true? Is it true that the Russians had units where they would have, for instance, 7 guys, and they would only give them 3 rifles? And the idea is that whenever one gets shot, he just grabs the rifle of the guy that was shot.
I mean, that wasn't the construction of units. That is an outcome of what happens after an intense amount of fighting, you know, and your combat effectiveness is drawn down. The United States did the same thing in the Pacific Islands, in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They were very similar. I mean, it wasn't an assigned thing. Here's 3 guns and the 3 of you don't have anything, but you know, it's sort of what wound up happening because so many soldiers or Marines or you know, Soviet forces were, you know, Soviet army, you know, were wounded or killed, and so it was almost like a byproduct of
But
that.
that's the opposite. That's when you
Yeah, but they did have a
Yeah.
squad. Sorry, they did have a squad, if I'm not mistaken, of soldiers that were instructed to shoot any
Yeah.
Russian soldiers that ran the other way, right?
Yes, of course.
Hadrian,
That definitely happened.
from what I heard, that was not on purpose.
Yeah.
It was because they said, especially in the beginning of the war, they were doing resupply of the weapons,
Yep.
and it turned out that they didn't have enough arms,
Yep.
you know, when the war started. So they would just ended up with this situation.
Exactly.
That was not on
just-
purpose.
I just find this to be really like the epitome of the Russian army. It's yeah,
Well-
like you have more men than they have bullets.
And
Yeah.
actually, one other quick thing that because I know Mikhail brought up about what do you call it, SMERSH, is that so they were able, and it's really phenomenal. They were able to confuse German intelligence with the awesome disinformation. So they played 183 radio games over the course of the war. So basically, acting as sort of false flag kind of communications between forces that weren't real. And in the end, the estimate is that the German military, based on their documentation, underestimated Soviet forces, and this is sort of a big deal, by 1 to 2 million. So that's I would call that one of the all-time wins in counterintelligence and in disinformation. And so that's just another one that I thought would be pretty interesting.
Aaron, was there an air component to Stalingrad?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was actually a massive air component to Stalingrad. There was thousands.
Both sides?
Yeah, on both sides. I mean, the problem is after a while. I mean, once again, once you start, once your forces start, compressing, then I mean, air power even today is, mostly accurate sometimes. It's not, and back in World War II and given the weather and and don't forget the weather was real then too, right? I mean, you're in the winter, you have snowstorms, you have I mean, the Germans had, let me get this right.
I think in the beginning they had like 2-1. Germans had
Yeah.
advantage.
So the Germans had 1,600 aircraft in the beginning, and then
if the Germans could block the Volga, if they could, they had dive bombers that were very accurate. If they could actually block the Volga, that would be it. If the Russians couldn't resupply Stalingrad.
Yep. No, I hear you. But if you look at the history of river operations at scale, that's pretty thin.
Yeah. They overreached, but that was the idea.
Yeah, no, that was the idea. But so by the counteroffensive, the Soviets, they had gone up from 300 aircraft to 1,150 aircraft. So, and of course the Germans had fallen. Basically, they'd lost over half their aircraft by that point. Actually, 3/4. So they're down to 400 by the time there's a counteroffensive.
And they were flying from the Ukraine, I assume?
Yeah, they were. There was a airfield, I forgot the name of it, but yeah, I forgot the name of it, but it was within a couple, within 100 miles or so, 100 odd miles.
But I assume they just couldn't penetrate that eastern front, that German front east of Stalingrad. So
Yeah,
they couldn't stem the flow of Russians into Stalingrad.
Exactly. So one of the things to understand is that at the beginning of the fight, there was about 2,000 artillery pieces. And then by the time of the counteroffensive, remember I showed you, I think well, yeah, here we go. I'll show it to you. I think that's worth seeing again, because I think you sort of, oh, here we go, sorry. Here we go. So you see, this is the artillery encirclement, right? So this is about 13,500 artillery pieces. So obviously there's never been that much artillery, probably up until that point, maybe combined in the history of the world, there probably hasn't been much more than 13,500 pieces of artillery. So, the Soviets, once they did this with, and understand what 13,500 pieces of artillery is, you're covering basically every sector and every cross sector of fire you can imagine, both in depth, and in width. So, and then obviously their forces, went in, and that was it.
It's also interesting that the only two things that have names on the map other than Stalingrad are the two airfields.
Yes.
Interesting. Yes.
Actually, very good point. Very good point there. Absolutely. So
1,300 or 13,000?
13,500 artillery pieces.
Wow.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, like I said, that's probably almost all the artillery up until that point in history that modern artillery, whatever, since maybe the Napoleonic era that had been created, is probably the Soviets probably had as much of it as anyone ever had up to that point in this battle. So it's just like, every Soviet soldier could have laid down and die, and you'd have a piece of artillery for every 20 Germans. You know what I mean? So it's like, forget about how many shells, right? You basically probably had 10 shells per German, there. It was just like, they just did not fully appreciate what they were walking into. And then there was also, what was I going to say? There's about 1,000 tanks. One interesting thing about this is that commands on both sides, it just tells you how, people were not fully formed in understanding what large urban warfare was going to be like. So both sides sort of thought tanks were going to be a little more important than they were, which of course, tanks are just is an old saying, tanks in a city are just metal coffins with wheels. So, it's just the last place you want to be in a city driving around is in a tank, because you're basically this great big target that is not very maneuverable. And to get out, you have to, open it up, and everyone knows that. And so that's really not an ideal place to be.
It's really amazing to think. They probably initially, the Germans declared victory. We've occupied Stalingrad.
Yeah.
And then within overnight, practically, it turns 180 degrees. It's
exactly.
Yeah, Aaron, they say the majority of the casualties in all of World War II were Russian soldiers overall. Would you say the majority was in this particular campaign, or whether it's a combination of few?
No. This is one of the large, contributors of that, right?
I think this was 1 million casualties for the Russians, I think.
Yeah.
How many?
Out of 25 million, so it's just...
Kiev encirclement alone was 1 million POWs.
Yeah.
So
1 million?
Yeah. It was the
I mean,
biggest
the
encirclement
Russians
ever.
lost between 25 and 30 during the war. I can't remember the exact number, but yeah, like basically any other country would have surrendered, but not Russia.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
You know,
Well, don't forget, who were they going to surrender to? The Germans were killing them all. I mean, there was
Exactly.
really no choice to
Yeah.
surrender.
Yep, exactly, exactly.
They were treating POWs like crap. I mean,
There were no POWs, right? I mean, it was just this, which of course, contributed to the amount of.
They didn't have the food to even feed themselves.
Right.
Like neither army had enough supplies, so.
They were nooses. They weren't camps. They were nooses to hang them, basically.
Well, it was an open field. I mean, in general, POW, Russian POWs were not, abide by the Switzerland Convention because of the fact that, I guess they didn't ratify it, or Soviet Union didn't ratify it.
The Germans said that the only prisoners of war that they caught, like the only Soviets that they could catch, were the ones that were too wounded to raise a weapon. So, so basically,
talking
unless,
specifically about the Stalingrad campaign.
Yeah, I'm talking about Stalingrad. So in Stalingrad, like if the Soviet was crawling on the ground and he could fire a weapon, you wouldn't catch him alive because you would have to shoot him. You will only catch him if he was so wounded that he couldn't even lift a weapon.
Right. Well, that sounds a bit legendary, but true in principle.
Yeah, in the first 6 months of war,
you can't take it literally.
outside of Stalingrad, there was a lot of POW, Russian POW, 3 million or so. It was crazy amount.
Yeah, so the whole Operation Barbarossa on all sides, it's estimated 5 to 6 million. The Battle of Minsk's about 500,000. Moscow's 1 million. Smolensk is 600,000. 1 million. So I mean, these are sort of the big ones. Case Blue, which is the German armored offensive between June 20. June and November 42 in the Caucasus. That was 1.4 million. I mean, so you just have. Oh yeah, this is one I never really knew much about, which was south of Moscow, and this is basically a month in the end of June to the end of July. The Battle of Voronezh, is that correct? Voronezh.
Voronezh.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Voronezh. Okay. Thank you. I gotta move to Russia for like 3 years so I can pronounce Russian.
Which means a crowd, basically.
Okay. So that one had 700,000. Which I just literally had never heard of that one. And then so
it didn't cross the 1 million mark. That's
yeah,
what I mean.
Sort of like it was like a middle one. It was like a middle one, right?
Give and take, yeah.
Yeah, give or take, right? What's interesting about Kursk is that while obviously it had the largest tank battles in history, proportionally, right? Like it's relative, is under 400,000. Which is obviously a lot, but and this is the other thing. So yeah, I forgot there was multiple battles in Smolensk, and so there was the first one, which was about 1 mil, and then the second one was about 550,000. Yeah, so I mean, the Battle of Narva, that's about 600,000. I mean, it was just. These numbers are like ridiculous. I mean, you just keep going and going and going.
As compared to the Western Front, what were the numbers there?
So, and the other one too. Hold on, last one is the Belarusian campaign, which I knew existed, but I just didn't realize was this massive. So about 1.5 million in that, which I just didn't know that was actually that big. I mean, like at a simple level, just assume it's an order of magnitude less. That would probably be the safe number. It's basically an order of magnitude. Actually, one that's pretty high, Battle of Gazala, which is the Western Desert Campaign. That's 150,000. Which, generally speaking, you don't usually have huge losses in the desert because it's a desert and people have vehicles and they drive away. So it's sort of very few. You don't tend to get trapped by terrain features in deserts. So that's sort of a pretty a remarkable one. The Chinese ones are pretty insane also. I mean, they're just, there's some like crazy madness to a lot of those. So there's dozens of those.
So basically the moral of the story was, since Russian put up the fight, they lost a lot of people, but others didn't really put up much of a fight. And
No. It's also because of their doctrine. Like their
the
military
doctrine
was the human weight. I think it was
Exactly.
literally called the human weight. So they would, like, actually one of the directives of Stalin was the Red Army shall be remembered as the most offensive army in the history of the world.
Yep.
Well, so they launched a lot of counteroffensives, even when they were undersupplied, and that cost them a lot of lives. But some historians today think that this was one of the reasons why the German war machine stopped so early, because they kept attritioning the Germans by their counteroffensive, even though they were extremely costly in human life.
Yeah, there's a myth that when the Germans were advancing on Stalingrad, that the Russians were deliberately retreating and sucking them in, when the facts are exactly opposite. The Soviets were constantly counterattacking and being ordered to do so by Stalin.
Yeah, and so one of the ones that's obviously, the biggest ever is the siege of Leningrad. So
I was talking specifically about the Stalingrad advance.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, I was talking earlier about casualties. Sorry about that. But
the siege of Leningrad was mostly civilians dying.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's sort of the pile of hell, right? I mean, it's at that point, it's I
want to do one on siege of Leningrad, and I particularly want to do on how the Russians tried to resupply the city, and it was just a death trap. I mean,
yeah, of course, absolutely,
Finnish forces and all that stuff.
Yep.
But definitely. I wanted to one more thing I wanted to end. I added to the schedule November 1st, the English Revolution, as I've promised, and Michael is doing the dissertation on it. He's going to present it. And that would be 1640, 1643. So that's an interesting one. And we have Battle of Kosovo. Murad and the I forget the name of the Serbian that stabbed him. So it's going to be interesting. The Kosovo battle. So tune in Saturday, and next Wednesday, Plutarch, Pericles. Please read. If you don't read, we'll still read the excerpts as per Greg, and then we'll discuss that. Thank you so much, everybody.
Absolutely.
Great. Aaron, Hadrian, thank you so much. On the whim, I know I told you in such a small time frame, you guys came up with a good thing.
No, thanks everyone for our last wonderful summer-like days that you can keep your windows open and it's in the 70s and stuff. So I think
great job, Hadrian, and Aaron.
Thank you.
Really informative. I enjoyed it the whole 3 hours.
I'm looking forward to the. Oh, by the way, Aaron, don't forget you're doing Karabakh with Rich.
Yes, I'm doing that at the end of
the month. 2 weeks. That's
2 weeks,
in 2 weeks. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, and we're doing the on 31st. We're doing the Agoge, right?
Agoge, yeah. Agoge and Sparta.
Yep, definitely.
Aaron is going to be very busy.
I'm busy, but this is fun stuff.
It's
my non-Pacific thing, so I'm having to work, which is good because the Pacific stuff I could just roll out of bed and throw one of those out.
Well, you'll have it down the road. I put it in the schedule.
Yeah. So now I'm going to go enjoy, you know, for as a celebration to the Battle of Stalingrad, I'll enjoy some of my net cost market Russian food right now. So I have some baka salad. So, you know.
Hey guys, and I'm gonna post this. Also, if you guys want to make comments on YouTube channel, because I'm gonna post this in part of comments, and then all these comments are gonna be on the YouTube channel. So if you're gonna go in, you can click on all the links, and you know, just let's create discussion. You know, talk about things. Any questions you have for Aaron, you know, he you know, and Hadrian. Do the discussion. It doesn't end today. It continues.
It's forever. You know, Zach, I just wanted to mention, I think everybody here almost was at the things last weekend, the last couple of weekends about the Persian, you know, the Greek-Persian wars.
Right. Which one? The Marathon or
Marathon? Both of them. Where my point was with to the issue of the woman commander in the Persian fleet.
Artemisia?
I just wanted to note that apparently, I think it was today, maybe just in the past week or so, Japan just announced the first woman commander of a Japan warship squadron. So women are on the seas again, guys. Watch out.
They are.
That's awesome. Listen, we're gonna have a scholar who's gonna talk about the women in Nordic culture, women Vikings. So, you know, tune in for that one. So
and can I just add, and when we talk about the Agoge, we're also going to talk about the women of Sparta, which is a very important aspect that a lot of people like overlook. So yeah, you women had a major role in ancient and modern society.
Right.
Yeah.
Better believe it.
It's incredible. And
also,
hey,
half the population, if nothing else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. See you guys Saturday at 12.
The important half of the population, more importantly.
Thanks all. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
Adrian.
All right,
Well
thank you.
stated,
All right, bye.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank
you.
Thank
Bye.
everybody. Thank you, Zach, for keeping this going.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone stay safe.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks, Hadrian. Bye, guys.
Yep.